The sun had barely crested the mountain peaks when Sarah Mitchell found herself standing at the edge of the Mitchell family property, a carpet bag clutched in her trembling hand. The early spring air bit through her worn shawl, but it wasn't the chill that caused her to shiver. It was Martha Mitchell's final words, cold and cutting as they'd echoed through the house. "My son is dead. You're no longer family. Get out." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months a widow, and now homeless. Sarah gazed back at the 2-story house that had been her home since marriage, a place where she'd once felt hope, however fleeting. Now the windows stared back like vacant eyes, indifferent to her fate. Cottonwood Springs stretched before her, a town that had never truly welcomed the outsider who'd stolen away their most eligible bachelor, only to lose him to a mining collapse before she could provide an heir. "Where will you go now, girl?" The question came from within her own mind, her mother's voice from years ago. Sarah had no answer, not a penny to her name, no family to return to, and a reputation tarnished by whispers she couldn't silence. Sarah had arrived in Cottonwood Springs 3 years earlier, a hopeful young woman of 20, following her father's death. With skilled hands and determined spirit, she'd found work as a seamstress at the town's general store. Thomas Mitchell had noticed her there, his quiet smiles gradually giving way to courtship. Their wedding day had been the happiest of her life and the beginning of her troubles with his parents. Martha and Ezekiel Mitchell owned the largest dry goods store in town. They'd had plans for their son, plans that hadn't included a penniless seamstress with no connections. Throughout their brief marriage, Sarah had endured their thinly veiled contempt, their constant criticism of her manners, her cooking, her inability to conceive. Thomas had defended her, but always gently, never forcing a true reckoning between his wife and his parents. Then the accident happened. Thomas, investigating a business opportunity at the new silver mine, was among 7 men lost when the shaft collapsed. Sarah's world shattered alongside her heart. For 6 months, the Mitchells had tolerated her presence, her grief a mirror of their own. But tolerance wasn't acceptance, and when Ezekiel announced his intention to sell the store and return east, with Martha, there was no place for Sarah in their plans. "We've given you time to mourn," Martha had said that morning, her voice flat. "We've fed you, clothed you, but Thomas is gone, and you're not blood. We're leaving at month's end and this house will be sold. You need to find other arrangements." When Sarah had asked where she might go with no money and no prospects, Martha's smile had been thin as a blade. "That's hardly our concern, is it? Perhaps if you'd given Thomas a son." Sarah had fled the house before her tears could fall. Pride was all she had left. Now she stood in the town square, her options as barren as the Wyoming winter had been. The sympathetic glances from townsfolk stung worse than outright scorn. Pity was a cold companion. She squared her shoulders and headed toward Mrs. Turner's boarding house. She had 2 weeks of seamstress work paid in advance. After that, God only knew. Mrs. Turner's face fell when Sarah explained her situation. "Oh, child, I wish I could help, but I've not a single room. Railroad surveyors have taken every bed." The older woman pressed a handkerchief into Sarah's palm. "Come back in a week. Perhaps something will open up." By sunset, Sarah had received the same response from every establishment in town. No rooms, no positions, always followed by that same pitying look. As darkness fell, she found herself outside the church, its steeple reaching toward an indifferent sky. Reverend Hoffman was lighting lamps when she entered. His wife had been kind to Sarah after Thomas's death, though the Reverend himself had always seemed uncomfortable around her, as if grief might be contagious. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted her, eyes widening at her carpetbag, "is everything all right?" The story spilled out before she could contain it. The Reverend's face pinched with each detail, his fingers fidgeting with his collar. "A most unfortunate situation," he said when she'd finished. "The Lord tests those he loves most dearly." "I need somewhere to stay, Reverend, just until I can find proper work." His eyes darted away. "The church has no accommodations suitable for a young woman. Propriety must be considered." He cleared his throat. "Perhaps the Mitchells will reconsider if I speak with them." Sarah knew they wouldn't. Martha Mitchell had made her decision, and Ezekiel never contradicted his wife. "I'll pray for guidance," the Reverend promised, already ushering her toward the door. "Come back tomorrow. Perhaps the Lord will have shown us a path by then." Outside again, the spring night had turned unexpectedly cold. A storm was building in the west, dark clouds swallowing stars one by one. Sarah clutched her bag tighter and made her way to the edge of town. There was a small stable behind the abandoned Harper place. Not ideal, but shelter from the coming rain. The stable was worse than she'd remembered, half the roof missing, the smell of rotting hay, and worse things permeating the air. Still, a corner remained dry enough. Sarah arranged her shawl as a cushion against the rough wood and settled in, her carpet bag serving as both pillow and anchor to her former life. She would not cry. Tears solved nothing. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the increasing violence of the storm. Wind found every gap in the walls, and soon rain began to drip through the damaged roof. Sarah huddled tighter, drawing her knees to her chest for warmth. By midnight, her sanctuary had become a prison of cold and wet. A particularly fierce gust tore away what remained of the stable door. Rain lashed inside, soaking Sarah to the skin within moments. She grabbed her bag and stumbled out into the storm. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating her surroundings. The Harper house loomed nearby, abandoned but more intact than the stable. Trespassing seemed a minor sin compared to pneumonia. The house's back door hung loose on its hinges. Sarah pushed inside, water streaming from her clothes onto warped floorboards. The air smelled of mildew and abandonment, but it was dry. She felt her way through darkness to what must have been a parlor. A tattered settee stood against one wall. It would do. Sarah had just settled onto the moldy cushions when a floorboard creaked overhead. Her breath caught. The house was supposed to be empty. "Who's there?" a man's voice called. Footsteps approached the stairs. Sarah froze. She could run back into the storm or face whoever was descending those steps. Neither option promised safety. The beam of a lantern appeared first, followed by the silhouette of a tall man. He held the light higher, and Sarah blinked against the sudden brightness. He was perhaps 35, with a face weathered by sun and wind. Dark hair fell past his collar, and a neatly trimmed beard couldn't hide the strong line of his jaw. His clothes were well made but practical, the garb of a working man who could afford quality. "Ma'am?" His voice held surprise rather than threat. "You're half drowned." Sarah stood, dignity battling with desperation. "The storm. I didn't realize anyone was here. I'll go." "Into that?" He gestured toward the window where rain lashed against glass. "That would be foolish." His frank assessment broke through her reserve. "I've nowhere else to go." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps of a fellow traveler along hard roads. "This place is barely standing, but I've got a fire going upstairs. You'll catch your death in those wet clothes." Sarah hesitated. A strange man, an abandoned house, the middle of the night. Her situation couldn't appear more compromising. Yet the alternative was the raging storm. She nodded once and gathered her bag. He led her upstairs to a room where, true to his word, a small fire burned in a rusted stove. A bedroll was laid out nearby, along with saddlebags and a rifle. The man gestured to a pile of blankets. I can step out while you change into something dry, he offered. Name's Jackson Wells, by the way. I own Raven Creek Ranch outside of town. Sarah Mitchell, she replied, then corrected herself. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell. If he recognized the name, he gave no indication. He simply nodded, handed her the lantern, and left the room, closing the door behind him. Sarah changed quickly, replacing her sodden dress with her only other one, a faded blue cotton kept in her carpet bag for emergencies. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders for additional warmth, then called out that he could return. Jackson entered with 2 tin cups of steaming liquid. Coffee, he explained, offering one to her. Not good coffee, but it's hot. The warmth of the cup seeped into Sarah's cold fingers. She sipped cautiously, the bitter brew more welcome than any tea from Martha Mitchell's china pot had ever been. Thank you, she said, realizing how inadequate the words were. Jackson settled on his bedroll, leaving the room's only chair for her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Storm caught you by surprise? In a manner of speaking. He didn't press for details, a courtesy Sarah appreciated. Instead, he explained his own presence in the abandoned house. I'm in town for the cattle auction. Every hotel room's taken, with the railroad men, so I remembered this place. Nathan Harper and I rode together years back. He glanced around the deteriorating room. Shame to see it fallen like this. Sarah listened, grateful for conversation that required nothing of her. The fire's warmth and the coffee's heat began to work their magic, her body relaxing despite her circumstances. You should get some rest, Mrs. Mitchell, Jackson said eventually. Take the chair. I'll make do on the floor. I couldn't possibly. You can and will, he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. No offense intended, ma'am, but you look dead on your feet. Chair's yours. Too exhausted to protest further, Sarah arranged herself as comfortably as possible in the wooden chair, pulling the blanket tight around her. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was Jackson Wells placing another log in the stove, his movements careful and quiet. She woke to sunlight streaming through cracked windows. The storm had passed, leaving a morning of startling clarity. For a moment, Sarah didn't remember where she was or why. Then it all flooded back. Martha's cruel dismissal, the fruitless search for lodging, the storm, and Jackson Wells, who was nowhere to be seen. Sarah stood, wincing at the stiffness in her neck from sleeping upright. His bedroll remained, neatly arranged, but his saddlebags were gone, as was his rifle. Something on the chair caught her attention. A folded piece of paper weighted down by coins, quite a few coins, in fact. She picked up the note. Mrs. Mitchell. Had to head to the auction early. Use this for room and board until you find your feet. No charity, just decent human behavior. Wells. Sarah counted the money with trembling hands. $15, more than a month's pay at her previous job. Pride warred with pragmatism. She couldn't accept such generosity from a stranger. Yet without it, where would she go? Before she could reach a decision, the door swung open. Jackson stood there, hat in hand, expression unreadable. You're still here, he said, as if he'd half expected her to vanish. Sarah held out the money. I can't accept this. Jackson didn't take it. Not asking you to. It's a loan, if that sits better. Why would you help me? You don't know me. His eyes, a deep blue she hadn't noticed in the lantern light, held hers steadily. I know what it's like to have nowhere to go. Something in his tone stopped Sarah's protests. There was history there, pain perhaps not unlike her own. She slowly lowered her hand, the money still clutched in her fingers. Thank you, she said simply. I'll repay you. Jackson nodded, seemingly satisfied. Auction's over earlier than expected. I'm heading back to my ranch. There's a position open there if you're interested. Housekeeper. Previous one left to get married last month. Sarah stared at him, suspicion flaring despite his even tone. A single woman working on a remote ranch for a man she'd just met? The impropriety was obvious. Jackson seemed to read her thoughts. My foreman's wife lives on the property with their 3 children. Cabin of your own comes with the position. $5 a week plus room and board. It was a generous offer. Too generous. Why me? There must be women in town looking for work. None that I know of who need it as badly, he answered bluntly. And I've been told you're a hard worker. Thomas Mitchell spoke highly of his wife's character. The mention of her husband's name was an unexpected blow. You knew Thomas? Jackson looked away briefly. We had business dealings. He was a fair man. Sarah weighed her options, though in truth she had few. Stay in town and face Martha Mitchell's scorn while scraping together a living from odd sewing jobs, or accept this unexpected opportunity despite its risks. When would you want me to start? Today, if you're willing. Wagons already loaded for the return trip. Sarah thought of her meager possessions in the carpet bag, of the life she'd thought she was building with Thomas, of the cruel twist of fate that had brought her to this moment of decision. I'll need to collect my things from the Mitchell house, she said finally. Jackson nodded. I'll wait here. Take your time. The walk through Cottonwood Springs felt interminable. Early risers stopped to stare at Sarah's rumpled appearance, her red-rimmed eyes. Let them stare. Let them wonder. She would be gone by nightfall. The Mitchell house loomed ahead, its white clapboard exterior gleaming in the morning sun. Sarah squared her shoulders and marched up the front steps. This would be the last time she entered as anything but a stranger. Martha was supervising the packing of china when Sarah entered the parlor. The older woman's eyebrows rose at Sarah's disheveled state. Where have you been? She demanded. People are talking. People always talk, Sarah replied, surprising herself with her even tone. I've come for my things. I'm leaving Cottonwood Springs today. Martha set down a teacup with deliberate care. Leaving? Where could you possibly go? I've accepted a position at Raven Creek Ranch. Martha's face paled, then flushed an angry red. Raven Creek, Jackson Wells's property. Have you lost your mind as well as your husband? No decent family would turn the son's widow into the street, Sarah interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. I'm doing what I must to survive. Ezekiel Mitchell appeared in the doorway, drawn by his wife's raised voice. What's happening here? Martha turned to her husband, hands fluttering in agitation. She's going to work for Jackson Wells, at his ranch, living there. Ezekiel's face darkened. Sarah, you cannot. The man's reputation is not my concern, Sarah finished for him. My survival is, unless you've reconsidered your position regarding my place in this household. The silence that followed gave her all the answer she needed. Sarah moved past them toward the stairs. I won't be long. In the room she'd shared with Thomas, Sarah gathered her few personal possessions. Her wedding band she placed carefully in a small wooden box alongside a lock of Thomas's hair and the dried flowers from her bridal bouquet. These memories, at least, couldn't be taken from her. When she returned downstairs, Martha waited alone, her face a careful mask of concern. Sarah, please reconsider. For Thomas's sake, if not your own. What would he think of you living under another man's roof? The manipulation was so transparent, it nearly made Sarah laugh. Thomas would want me to survive, to find happiness again someday. Happiness? With a man like Jackson Wells? Martha's voice dripped with disdain. Do you even know who he is, where he came from? I know he offered help when his Christian neighbors would not, Sarah replied simply. She moved toward the door, then paused. Goodbye, Mrs. Mitchell. I wish you well in your journey east. Martha's parting words followed her onto the porch. When your reputation is in tatters, don't come crying back to us. You've made your choice. Sarah didn't look back. The weight she'd carried since Thomas's. Death seemed lighter somehow, as if leaving this house had severed chains she hadn't known she wore. Jackson was waiting where she'd left him, his wagon loaded with supplies. He took her carpet bag without comment and helped her onto the seat. Within minutes, they were leaving Cottonwood Springs behind, the town growing smaller as Raven Creek. Ranch beckoned from the horizon. Sarah didn't know what awaited her, a new beginning perhaps, or simply a different kind of ending. But for the first time in months, she felt something stir within her chest. Not quite hope, but its distant cousin. Possibility. As the wagon crested a hill, Jackson glanced her way. Regrets? Sarah thought of Martha Mitchell's final warning, of the abandoned stable where she'd spent the night, of Thomas's grave she hadn't had a chance to visit one last time. No, she answered truthfully. No regrets. The journey to Raven Creek Ranch took the better part of the day. Sarah watched the landscape transform around them, from the modest buildings of Cottonwood Springs to rolling plains dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers. The spring air carried the scent of damp earth and new growth, a promise of renewal that Sarah dared not embrace. Jackson maintained a comfortable silence, speaking only to point out landmarks or to check on her comfort. By midday, they stopped near a creek to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of bread and dried beef. "How much further?" Sarah asked, stretching her legs. "About 3 hours if the weather holds." Jackson glanced at the sky, where clouds gathered on the western horizon. "Might be another storm coming. We should make it before it hits." Sarah nodded, trying to ignore the growing ache in her back from the wagon's hard seat. The water from the creek was cold and refreshing as she splashed it on her face, washing away the dust of travel. "This land," she said, gesturing to the expanse around them, "it's beautiful." Jackson's expression softened slightly. "Wyoming gets in your blood. Hard country, but honest." He paused, then added, "It won't lie to you like people do." There was history in those words, Sarah thought, pain, perhaps not unlike her own. They resumed their journey, the wagon creaking beneath them as it navigated the uneven terrain. By late afternoon, they crested a hill, and Jackson pulled the horses to a stop. "Raven Creek," he said simply, nodding toward the valley below. Sarah caught her breath. The ranch spread across the valley floor, larger than she had imagined. A whitewashed main house sat at the center, surrounded by several outbuildings, barns, and corrals. A bunkhouse stood a respectful distance from the main house, and beyond it, a smaller cabin nestled against a stand of cottonwoods. Fields of new grass stretched toward distant hills where cattle grazed in scattered groups. "It's substantial," she managed, suddenly aware of what she had agreed to. This was no modest homestead, but a thriving operation. Jackson's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. 5,000 acres, 200 head of cattle. Could be more, but I'm particular about quality over quantity. As they approached, Sarah noticed details she had missed from the hilltop. The main house was well maintained, but not ostentatious, its porch adorned with several rocking chairs. Smoke curled from the chimney, and flowers had been planted along the walkway, though they were only beginning to emerge from the soil. A woman appeared on the porch as they pulled up, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face lined by years in the elements. She smiled as she spotted Jackson, but her expression turned curious when she noticed Sarah. "Mr. Wells, you're back earlier than expected," she called, descending the steps. "The auction concluded satisfactorily." "Well enough, Mrs. Cooper." Jackson helped Sarah down from the wagon before addressing the woman. "This is Mrs. Sarah Mitchell. She'll be taking over the housekeeping position." Mrs. Cooper's eyes widened slightly. "I see." Well, that's unexpected, but welcome news indeed. She extended a hand to Sarah. Maggie Cooper, my husband Frank is Mr. Wells's foreman. Sarah took the offered hand, grateful for the woman's composure. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Cooper. Maggie, please. No need for formalities out here. Her gaze was appraising but not unkind. You've come from Cottonwood Springs? Before Sarah could answer, the door to the main house banged open, and 3 children tumbled out, 2 boys of perhaps 8 and 10, and a girl of about 6. They raced toward Mrs. Cooper, stopping short when they noticed Sarah. Children, mind your manners, Maggie admonished. This is Mrs. Mitchell. She'll be staying with us. The children mumbled greetings, their eyes darting curiously between Sarah and Jackson. Mrs. Cooper, perhaps you could show Mrs. Mitchell to the housekeeper's cabin, Jackson suggested. I imagine she'd like to settle in before dinner. Of course. Maggie gestured for Sarah to follow her. Come along, dear. It's not fancy, but it's clean and sound. As they walked, Maggie explained the layout of the ranch. Main house is Mr. Wells's, of course. Bunk house is for the hands, 5. Currently, plus my Frank. Our family quarters are attached to the bunkhouse, but separate, mind you, proper walls and a door that locks. She smiled. Mr. Wells is particular about such things. The housekeeper's cabin was indeed small, but as promised, clean and well-maintained. A single room with a curtained-off sleeping area, it contained a small stove, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the window, and a sturdy chest of drawers. The bed, when Sarah peeked behind the curtain, was neatly made with fresh linens. Previous housekeeper left things in good order, Maggie explained. Ellen was with us 3 years before she married one of the hands from the Henderson place. She opened a cupboard, revealing dishes and basic provisions. There's flour, sugar, coffee and such here. You'll take most meals at the main house. Of course, but sometimes it's nice to have your own quiet breakfast. Sarah set her carpetbag on the bed, reality settling around her like a cloak. This was her home now, this tiny cabin on a stranger's ranch, miles from everything familiar. Are you well, dear? Maggie asked, her expression concerned. You look a bit peaked. Just tired, Sarah assured her. It's been a trying few days. Maggie's eyes held understanding. I won't pry, but if you need an ear, I'm available. She moved toward the door. Rest a bit. Dinner's at 6 in the main house. I'll have one of the boys come fetch you. Alone at last, Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed. Exhaustion washed over her in waves, not just physical, but emotional. She had fled one life and stumbled into another, with barely a moment to breathe between them. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back. There would be time enough for tears when she was certain of her footing in this new world. The cabin, despite its small size, was thoughtfully arranged. A basin and pitcher sat atop the chest of drawers, along with a small mirror. Sarah poured water from the pitcher and washed her face and hands, then unpacked her few possessions. The wooden box containing her wedding ring and Thomas's lock of hair she placed carefully in the drawer beside the bed. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. The younger of the Cooper boys stood there, shuffling his feet. Ma, sent me to fetch you for dinner, ma'am, he said. I'm Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. Sarah smoothed her hair and followed the boy toward the main house. The interior of Jackson Wells's home surprised her. She had expected a bachelor's sparse quarters, but instead found comfortable furnishings, well-worn but quality pieces that spoke of permanence. The walls held landscape paintings and a few photographs, and bookshelves lined one wall of the sitting room, filled with volumes whose spines showed the wear of frequent reading. The dining room centered around a large oak table that could easily seat 12, though only 5 places were set tonight. Jackson stood when she entered, gesturing to a chair. Mrs. Mitchell, I hope you've had time to settle in. Thank you. Yes. Sarah took the offered seat, conscious of the curious glances from a man she presumed was Mr. Cooper and the third-place setting, which remained empty. As if reading her question, Jackson explained, "My brother Ethan sometimes joins us. He has his own spread northeast of here, but he's helping with a difficult carving tonight." The meal was simple but abundant: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and early spring greens. Conversation flowed easily among the others, with occasional efforts to include Sarah. Frank Cooper proved to be a thoughtful man with a dry wit that complemented his wife's more effusive nature. The children, having been fed earlier, were now occupied with chores, leaving the adults to dine in relative peace. "Mrs. Mitchell," Frank said as the meal drew to a close, "Jackson tells us you're from Cottonwood Springs. My cousin Will works at the mercantile there." Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Will Cooper, yes, I know him." She forced a smile. Small world. Frank nodded. "Indeed." He broke off as his wife laid a hand on his arm. "Frank, let the poor woman eat in peace," Maggie admonished. "There'll be time enough for getting acquainted." Sarah shot Maggie a grateful look. The last thing she needed was talk of Cottonwood Springs and the whispers that had surely begun circulating about her departure. Jackson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mitchell, I thought tomorrow Maggie might show you the household routines, unless you'd prefer a day to rest?" "No, I'm eager to begin," Sarah replied, perhaps too quickly. Work would be a welcome distraction from her thoughts. After dinner, as Sarah prepared to return to her cabin, Jackson asked her to remain behind for a moment. Her stomach tightened with apprehension. Had he already heard something from town? Was he reconsidering his offer? When they were alone, he gestured for her to take a seat in the sitting room. "I want to be clear about your position here," he began, his tone businesslike. "Your duties include keeping the main house in order, preparing meals, and managing household supplies. You'll have Sundays off and one afternoon a week as you choose." Sarah nodded. "Standard arrangements for household staff. Your private life is your own," Jackson continued. "I don't inquire into my employees' personal matters, nor do I expect them to share them unless they choose to." He paused. "However, I should tell you that word travels fast in Wyoming territory. Whatever circumstances brought you here may follow." The implied question hung in the air between them. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "My husband died 6 months ago. His parents have decided to return east and sell their property. They made it clear I was not welcome to accompany them. That's the entirety of my situation." Jackson studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Thank you for your candor. I don't require detailed explanations, Mrs. Mitchell. I judge people by their actions here, not their past elsewhere." Relief washed through Sarah. "I appreciate that, Mr. Wells. One more thing." He rose and went to a desk in the corner, returning with a small leather pouch. "Your first week's wages in advance. I imagine there are items you'll want to purchase." Sarah hesitated before accepting the pouch. The weight of the coins inside represented something precious, independence, however modest. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I won't disappoint you." Jackson's expression remained unreadable. "Get some rest, Mrs. Mitchell. Ranch life starts early." As Sarah walked back to her cabin through the gathering dusk, she felt eyes on her. Glancing up, she saw a figure on horseback silhouetted against the darkening sky, a man watching from the ridge overlooking the ranch. For a moment, their gazes seemed to meet across the distance. Then he turned his horse and disappeared into the shadows. That night, Sarah slept better than she had in months, the exhaustion of recent days finally claiming her. She woke to birdsong and pale light filtering through the cabin's single window. For a disorienting moment, she didn't recognize her surroundings. Then memory returned. Raven Creek Ranch, her new home, at least for now. She dressed quickly and stepped outside. The ranch was already alive with activity, despite the early hour. Men moved between the barn and corral, horses nickered, and the distant bawl of cattle carried on the morning air. The sky stretched endlessly above, a vast blue canvas unmarked by clouds. Maggie Cooper spotted her from the main house porch and waved her over. "Good morning. Sleep well?" "Surprisingly, yes." "Wonderful. Come have some breakfast, and I'll show you around." The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of coffee and baking bread. Maggie explained that she had been handling the cooking since Ellen's departure, in addition to her other duties. "Frank says I've been spread thinner than water gravy," she chuckled. "I'm glad for the help, especially with spring roundup coming." Over breakfast, Maggie outlined the rhythm of ranch life, the early mornings and long days, the seasonal cycles that governed everything from calving to haying to the fall drive. "Mr. Wells runs a tight operation," she explained. "Not like some outfits where the men are half wild and the cattle are barely better. He expects hard work, but he's fair. Pays. Better than most, too." "How long have you and Mr. Cooper worked here?" Sarah asked. "Going on 8 years now. We came out from Illinois after Frank's brother took over the family farm. Best decision we ever made." Maggie refilled Sarah's coffee cup. "Mr. Wells was just getting started then. Had the land but not much else. Built it all up piece by piece." Sarah's surprise must have shown on her face, for Maggie smiled. "Oh, he wasn't always prosperous. Came west with just his brother and whatever they could carry. Story is, they were running from something back east. But Frank says that's just cowboy talk." Before Sarah could inquire further, the kitchen door opened and Jackson entered. He nodded to both women. "Mrs. Cooper, Mrs. Mitchell, I trust you slept well?" "Yes, thank you," Sarah replied, rising automatically. Jackson gestured for her to remain seated. "No need to stand on ceremony. I just came to let you know we'll have 2 extra for dinner tonight. Ethan's bringing Abraham Porter from the bank in Cheyenne." Maggie's eyebrows rose slightly. "The banker, what's the occasion?" "Just business," Jackson replied, but something in his tone suggested more. "Nothing fancy needed. But perhaps your apple pie wouldn't go amiss, Mrs. Mitchell, if you're amenable." "Of course," Sarah agreed, though she wondered how he knew about her pie. As if reading her thoughts, he added, "Thomas mentioned once that his wife made the best apple pie in the territory. I assume that was you?" The casual reference to her husband caught Sarah off guard. Yes, it was a family recipe. Jackson nodded, satisfied. "Good. I'll be out with the herd today. Frank knows where to find me if needed." After he departed, Maggie gave Sarah a speculative look. "That's interesting. Mr. Wells doesn't usually request specific dishes. Perhaps he just wanted to make me feel useful," Sarah suggested, uncomfortable with the implied significance. Maggie shook her head. "That man doesn't say things without meaning them. If he asked for your pie, he wants your pie." The rest of the morning was spent learning the layout of the main house, where supplies were kept, and Jackson's preferences regarding meals and the running of his household. He was, it seemed, a man of simple but exacting tastes, quality over ostentation, order without rigidity. "He likes his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in," Maggie advised. "Breakfast at 5, dinner at 6, supper after dark for the hands. He doesn't mind if you serve family style when it's just the usual crowd, but he prefers proper service when there are guests." By midday, Sarah's head was swimming with information. Maggie, noticing her fatigue, suggested a break. "Why don't you take a walk? Get the feel of the place. I'll handle lunch for the men today." Sarah gratefully accepted the offer, moving from the main house toward the creek that gave the ranch its name. The water ran clear and swift, fed by mountain snowmelt. Cottonwood trees lined its banks, their new leaves shimmering in the spring breeze. She followed the creek a short distance, relishing the solitude after the morning's intensive instruction. A sound made her turn, the soft nicker of a horse. On the opposite bank stood a magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming in the sunlight. Astride, it was a man Sarah hadn't seen before, younger than Jackson but with a similar bearing. He raised a hand in greeting. "You must be Mrs. Mitchell," he called. "I'm Ethan Wells." "Mr. Wells," Sarah acknowledged. "Your brother mentioned you might be joining us for dinner." Ethan guided his horse across the creek, the water barely reaching its knees at the shallow crossing. Up close, the family resemblance was striking, the same blue eyes, though Ethan's face was less weathered, his manner more open. "Jackson doesn't usually hire help without consulting me first," he said, though his tone held curiosity rather than accusation. "You must have made quite an impression." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. "It was a matter of fortunate timing, I believe." Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Well, welcome to Raven Creek. How are you finding it so far?" "Beautiful, if a bit overwhelming," she admitted. "It's very different from town life." "You'll adjust," he said confidently. "Most do, or they leave quickly. There's not much middle ground out here." Sarah thought of Cottonwood Springs, of Martha Mitchell's disdain, of the life she had left behind. "I intend to adjust." Ethan's smile was quick and warm. "Good. The West needs more women with backbone." He tipped his hat. "I should get back to my place before my foreman thinks I've abandoned him. See you at dinner, Mrs. Mitchell." As he turned his horse, a thought occurred to Sarah. "Mr. Wells, last night, was that you on the ridge overlooking the ranch?" Ethan's expression shifted subtly. "No, ma'am. I was at my place until dawn." He hesitated. "Did you get a good look at the rider?" "No, just a silhouette." "Mention it to Jackson," he advised, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Probably just one of the hands checking fence lines, but best to be sure." With that, he urged his horse forward, splashing back across the creek and disappearing into the trees on the far side. Sarah continued her walk, but Ethan's reaction had unsettled her. Was there reason to be concerned about an unknown rider watching the ranch, or was she being overly sensitive after the upheavals of recent days? By the time she returned to the main house, preparations for dinner were underway. Maggie had already peeled apples for the pie, and the kitchen smelled of roasting meat and fresh bread. "There you are," Maggie said cheerfully. "Feel better for the air?" "Much, thank you." Sarah washed her hands and tied on an apron. "I met Ethan Wells at the creek." "Did you now? And what did you make of our second Mr. Wells?" "He seems less reserved than his brother." Maggie laughed. "That's diplomatic. Ethan's a charmer, always has been. Takes after their father, from what I hear. Jackson's more like their mother, steadier, keeps his thoughts to himself." As they worked, Sarah found herself enjoying Maggie's company. The woman had a gift for conversation that put others at ease, sharing information without prying for more than Sarah was willing to give. "This banker coming tonight," Sarah ventured. "Is it a regular occurrence?" "Abraham Porter. Lord, no. He's only been out here once before, when Jackson was securing financing for the new breeding stock last fall." Maggie lowered her voice, though they were alone in the kitchen. "Frank thinks Mr. Wells might be looking to expand again. There's a property bordering ours to the west, the old Morrison place. Been sitting empty since John Morrison died last winter." The pie came together quickly, Sarah's hands working from memory as she mixed the spiced filling and prepared the crust. As she slid it into the oven, a sense of accomplishment warmed her. This small task, this creation of something from nothing, felt like a step toward reclaiming herself. The afternoon passed in a flurry of activity as the house was made ready for guests. Sarah arranged fresh flowers from Maggie's early garden on the dining table and polished silver that looked as though it hadn't been used in some time. "Mr. Wells's mother's pieces," Maggie explained when she noticed Sarah's careful handling of the ornate serving dishes. only comes out for special occasions. By 5 o'clock, Sarah had changed into her one good dress, a navy blue wool that had seen better days but still maintained a certain dignity. She twisted her hair into a neat knot and pinched her cheeks for color before returning to the kitchen to oversee the final dinner preparations. Jackson appeared shortly after, freshly shaven and dressed in clean clothes, though still unmistakably a working rancher rather than a city gentleman. He inspected the dining room with approval. "You've done well, Mrs. Mitchell." "Thank you." The simple praise shouldn't have pleased her as much as it did. "You're welcome, Mr. Wells." The sound of horses approaching announced the arrival of their guests. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as Jackson greeted his brother and another man, presumably Abraham Porter, in the yard. The banker was a portly gentleman with mutton chop whiskers and the prosperous look of someone whose battles were fought with pen and paper rather than elements and cattle. A fourth man accompanied them, one Sarah didn't recognize. Tall and lean, he had the hard look of a man accustomed to trouble. His eyes scanned the ranch with practiced assessment, lingering briefly on the main house before following the others inside. "Who is that?" Sarah asked Maggie. "The man with Mr. Porter." Maggie peered out the window, her expression darkening slightly. "That's Isaiah Blackwood. Works for the bank as a security consultant, though some say he's more enforcer than consultant. He looks dangerous." "He is," Maggie replied simply. "Stay clear of him if you can." The men settled in the sitting room with drinks while final dinner preparations were completed. Sarah could hear their voices, Jackson's measured tones, Ethan's more animated speech, Porter's occasional booming laugh, and the conspicuous silence of the fourth man. At 6 precisely, Jackson appeared in the kitchen doorway. "We're ready." "When you are, Mrs. Mitchell." Dinner proceeded smoothly, the conversation flowing between cattle prices, railroad expansion, and territorial politics. Sarah served efficiently, grateful that her years helping at church socials had prepared her for such duties. She noticed that while Porter addressed his remarks primarily to Jackson, his eyes often strayed to her, his gaze assessing in a way that made her skin crawl. Blackwood, for his part, said little, but missed nothing. Twice, Sarah caught him studying her with an intensity that raised the hair on the back of her neck. The apple pie was met with appreciation, particularly from Ethan, who declared it the best he'd tasted since their mothers. Jackson's nod of approval was more restrained, but no less genuine. As Sarah cleared the dessert plates, Porter's voice followed her to the kitchen. "You've done well for yourself, Wells. New stock, new housekeeper, quite the operation you're building." She didn't hear Jackson's reply, but something in Porter's tone suggested his interest extended beyond banking matters. When she returned with coffee, the conversation had shifted to the Morrison property. "15,000 is my final offer," Porter was saying. "The land's been idle too long. You know as well as I do that Morrison's widow will never return from St. Louis to claim it. 12,000 is more than fair," Jackson countered. "The fences are down, the well needs work, and half the outbuildings are falling apart." Porter's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps, but you need that water access for your western pastures, especially if the drought they're predicting comes to pass." A tense silence followed. Sarah busied herself with pouring coffee, acutely aware of the currents flowing beneath the surface of the conversation. 14,000, Jackson finally said. "And that includes the remaining stock and equipment." Porter considered, then nodded. "Done. I'll have the papers drawn up." He turned to Sarah with a smile that set her teeth on edge. "And perhaps your charming housekeeper would be so kind as to bring us a celebratory brandy." Sarah nodded and withdrew to the kitchen, relieved to escape the banker's gaze. As she arranged glasses on a tray, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she found Isaiah Blackwood standing in the doorway, watching her with those cold, calculating eyes. "You're new," he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "From Cottonwood Springs, they say." Sarah straightened, refusing to show discomfort. Yes. Interesting timing, your arrival, just when Wells decides to expand. He took a step closer. People might wonder about that. I don't see why they should, Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady. Mr. Wells needed a housekeeper. I needed employment. It's a simple arrangement. Blackwood's smile was thin and humorless. Nothing simple out here, Mrs. Mitchell, especially not when it involves Jackson Wells. Before Sarah could respond, Jackson himself appeared in the doorway. His expression hardened as he took in the scene. Blackwood, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Is there something you need? Oh, the security consultant stepped back, hands raised in mock surrender. Just making conversation with your new employee. No harm intended. Mrs. Mitchell isn't part of our business discussions. I'd appreciate you remembering that. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, years of history and unspoken tension crackling between them. Finally, Blackwood inclined his head in a gesture that contained no actual deference. As you wish. It's your ranch. He turned to Sarah, tipping an imaginary hat. For now. He brushed past Jackson and returned to the dining room. Jackson watched him go, then turned to Sarah. Did he bother you? No, she lied. He was just curious about my background. Jackson's jaw tightened. Blackwood's curiosity is never innocent. Be careful around him. Who is he, really? Sarah asked, unable to contain her curiosity. He seems to have some history with you. For a moment, she thought Jackson wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, running, a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of weariness. Isaiah Blackwood and I knew each other back east. Let's just say we had different ideas about how to conduct business. He met her eyes directly. He holds grudges, Mrs. Mitchell, and he doesn't distinguish between business and personal matters. The warning was clear, though Jackson left its exact nature unspecified. Sarah nodded her understanding. I'll be... and careful. Jackson's expression softened slightly. Good. Now, perhaps that brandy, before Porter thinks we've forgotten him. As Sarah carried the tray to the dining room, she felt the weight of unseen complications settling around her. She had fled Cottonwood Springs, hoping for simplicity, for a quiet place to rebuild her life away from judgment and painful memories. Instead, she had stepped into a web of relationships and conflicts she was only beginning to perceive. Yet as she served brandy to the men, catching Jackson's nod of approval and Ethan's warm smile, she felt an unexpected sense of belonging. This place, these people, they were not what she had imagined for herself after Thomas's death. But perhaps, just perhaps, they were what she needed. Later that night, as she walked back to her cabin under a sky ablaze with stars, Sarah heard a horse's soft nicker from the darkness. She turned, peering into the shadows, but saw nothing. Still, the sensation of being watched prickled along her spine. She quickened her pace, Jackson's warning about Blackwood echoing in her mind. As she reached her cabin, a movement caught her eye. A figure on horseback silhouetted against the night sky at the edge of the ranch, the same vantage point as the previous night. Sarah hurried inside, securing the door behind her. As she prepared for bed, questions tumbled through her mind. Who was watching the ranch? Was it Blackwood or someone else entirely? And why had Jackson Wells, a man who clearly valued his privacy and independence, invited her into his home with so little hesitation? Sleep was long in coming that night, and when it did, Sarah's dreams were filled with shadowy riders and the echo of Martha Mitchell's parting words, "When your reputation is in tatters, don't come crying back to us." In the darkness before dawn, Sarah woke with a start, certain she had heard a sound outside her cabin. She lay perfectly still, listening intently. Nothing. Just the whisper of wind in the cottonwoods and the distant howl of a coyote. Still, as she rose to begin her second day at Raven Creek Ranch, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that forces beyond her understanding were gathering around her, drawing her into a story far more complex than she had anticipated. Days at Raven Creek Ranch fell into a rhythm that Sarah found surprisingly comforting. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Jackson and the ranch hands, spent mornings cleaning and organizing the main house, and afternoons planning and preparing meals. The work was demanding but straightforward, a welcome contrast to the emotional complexities of her life in Cottonwood Springs. 2 weeks after her arrival, Sarah stood at the kitchen window, kneading bread dough while watching. Rain sweep across the valley. Spring in Wyoming brought unpredictable weather, warm sunshine, giving way to sudden storms that turned the ranch roads to mud and kept the men close to the buildings. The kitchen door opened and Jackson entered, shaking water from his hat. His boots left muddy prints on the floor Sarah had just scrubbed, but she kept her sigh internal. Such was ranch life. "Sorry about the mess," he said, noticing her glance. "Weather's turning again. Might snow by nightfall." In April, Sarah couldn't hide her surprise. "Welcome to Wyoming," Jackson replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "We've had snow as late as June. Never count on the weather staying put out here." He moved to the stove where coffee percolated, pouring himself a cup before turning back to her. "The hands are bringing in a stray heifer that's calving. Early. Might need the front room for the calf if it comes in this storm." Sarah paused in her kneading, flour dusting her forearms. "The front room of the house, if necessary." Jackson sipped his coffee, watching her reaction. "Problem with that?" She thought of the polished floors, the carefully arranged furniture, the relative order she'd worked to maintain. Then she thought of a newborn calf, wet and vulnerable in the cold spring rain. "No," she decided. "No problem. I'll prepare some clean blankets just in case." Something like approval flickered in Jackson's eyes. "Good. Frank and the boys are doing what they can in the barn, but we're short on dry space with the leaks in the east roof." Sarah resumed her kneading, pressing the heels of her hands into the dough with perhaps more force than necessary. "Will this delay the roundup?" "A day or two at most. We need to get the new stock moved to the Morrison property soon. Porter's already making noises about additional interest if we don't complete the transfer by month's end." The mention of the banker made Sarah's shoulders tense. Abraham Porter had returned to Raven Creek once since the night of the purchase, ostensibly to review property boundaries, but spending more time watching Sarah than examining maps. His security consultant, Isaiah Blackwood, had accompanied him but remained notably absent from the discussions, choosing instead to ride the perimeter of the ranch with an attention that felt more like surveillance than security. "Will Mr. Porter be returning before the transfer is complete?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Jackson's expression hardened slightly. "Not if I can help it. Porter's interest in ranch operations extends beyond banking concerns." The ambiguity of his statement hung in the air between them. Sarah focused on shaping the dough into loaves, unsure how to respond. After a moment, Jackson drained his coffee cup and set it on the counter. "Ethan's coming by this afternoon with papers from the land office. We'll need supper for two." Sarah nodded, grateful for the shift in topic. "I've got a venison stew. That should do nicely in this weather." "Perfect." Jackson headed for the door, then paused. "Mrs. Mitchell?" She looked up from her bread. "Yes?" "You've done well here. Better than I expected, truth be told." The compliment, unexpected and plainly stated, warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you, Mr. Wells." He nodded once and was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Sarah finished the bread and set the loaves to rise, her mind turning over Jackson's words. Better than expected. What had he expected? Had he anticipated failure? Complaints about the isolation, the work, the primitive conditions compared to town life, or something else entirely? Since her arrival, Jackson had remained polite but distant, their interactions limited to discussions of household matters or ranch business. Yet occasionally she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, as if measuring her against some internal standard only he understood. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof and windows. Sarah wiped down the counters and swept the floor, erasing Jackson's muddy footprints. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to the mysterious rider she'd glimpsed several times since her arrival. Always at dusk or dawn, always watching from the ridge, always gone before she could alert anyone to the presence. She'd mentioned it once to Maggie, who had frowned and advised her to tell Jackson directly. Yet something held Sarah back. Perhaps the fear of appearing hysterical or imaginative, perceptions that had dogged her in Cottonwood Springs when she tried to defend herself against gossip. A commotion outside drew her to the window. 3 riders approached the house, hunched against the driving rain. Between them, they led a horse bearing what appeared to be a body draped across the saddle. Sarah's heart lurched. She flung open the door and stepped onto the porch, heedless of the rain. "What's happened?" Frank Cooper dismounted quickly, moving to the draped figure. "Ethan's been shot. Need to get him inside, quick." "Shot?" Sarah gasped. "By whom?" "Questions later," Frank said grimly. "Help me get him to a bed." The other riders, 2 young ranch hands named Caleb and Joseph, carefully lifted Ethan from the horse. His face was ashen, blood staining his shirt around his left shoulder. He was conscious but clearly in pain, his breath coming in harsh gasps. "Sarah," he managed as they carried him past her. "Sorry about the timing." "Hush," she admonished, leading the way to the first-floor guest room. "Save your strength." They laid Ethan on the bed, and Sarah immediately began removing his wet clothes. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and my sewing kit," she instructed the men. "And someone find Jackson." The men dispersed to follow her orders, while Sarah assessed Ethan's injury. The bullet had entered his shoulder from behind, a through-and-through wound that had missed vital areas but caused significant bleeding. He was lucky, but infection remained a serious concern. "Ambushed," Ethan said through gritted teeth as she cut away his shirt. "Ridge Road. Didn't see them until—" "Don't talk," Sarah interrupted. "We need to stop this bleeding first." She pressed clean cloths against both the entry and exit wounds, relieved when Jackson burst into the room, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What happened?" he demanded, looking to his brother. "Bushwhacked," Ethan managed. 2 riders, masked. Took the papers. Jackson's jaw tightened. "Description? Horses, clothing, anything?" Ethan shook his head weakly. "Dark clothes. One had a gray horse. Couldn't see much." Frank appeared with a basin of hot water and Sarah's sewing kit. "Joseph's riding for the doctor in Eagle Pass," he reported. "But with this weather—" "I can manage until he arrives," Sarah said, more confidently than she felt. She'd assisted the doctor in Cottonwood Springs occasionally and had stitched minor wounds before, but never a gunshot. "Mr. Wells, I need to clean and stitch the wound. It would be better if—" "I'm staying," Jackson said firmly, moving to his brother's side. "What do you need me to do?" For the next hour, Sarah worked methodically to clean, disinfect, and stitch Ethan's wounds, with Jackson supporting his brother and following her instructions without question. Ethan bore the pain stoically, losing consciousness only when she irrigated the wounds with whiskey. By the time she finished, the storm outside had intensified to a full gale, wind howling around the house and sleet tapping against the windows. Any hope of the doctor arriving that night had vanished with the deteriorating weather. "He needs rest and warmth," Sarah said, washing blood from her hands in a fresh basin. "And we'll need to watch for fever." Jackson nodded, his eyes never leaving his brother's pale face. "I'll sit with him." "We should take turns," Sarah suggested. "It could be a long night." For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then his shoulders slumped slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly. Sarah left them alone and returned to the kitchen, where Frank waited for instructions. The foreman's worried expression mirrored her own concerns. "This wasn't random," he said bluntly. "Those papers were the final transfer documents for the Morrison property. Without them, the sale can't complete by Porter's deadline." Sarah frowned. "You think Mr. Porter arranged the attack?" "Not directly, perhaps, but that man Blackwood—" Frank shook his head. "He has a reputation for solving problems without concerning himself about methods." The implication chilled Sarah. "Should we send for the sheriff? Sheriff Hardin won't ride out in this weather, and by the time he could get here, any tracks will be washed away." Frank's expression darkened. "Besides, without proof, it's just speculation. Blackwood's too smart to leave evidence." "What will Mr. Wells do?" "Exactly what needs doing," Frank replied, his tone suggesting absolute confidence in his employer. "Jackson Wells didn't build this ranch by letting men like Blackwood dictate terms." After Frank left to check on the hands and the heifer that was still threatening to calve, Sarah prepared a tray with broth, bread, and coffee for the Wells brothers. When she entered the guest room, she found Jackson sitting beside the bed, his expression unreadable as he watched Ethan's fitful sleep. "You should eat something," she said, setting the tray on the bedside table. Jackson looked up, seeming almost surprised by her presence. "Thank you. How is he?" "Resting. No fever yet." He accepted the cup of coffee she offered. "Where did you learn to handle wounds like that?" "My father was the town doctor in Greeley before we moved to Cottonwood Springs," Sarah explained. "I assisted him until his death." "You never mentioned that." "You never asked." The simple exchange hung between them, highlighting the strange formality they had maintained, despite living under the same roof for weeks. Jackson's gaze returned to his brother. "We've been together since he was born. Our mother died bringing him into the world. Father raised us alone until I was 17. Then a logging accident took him too." His voice was flat, factual, yet Sarah sensed the deep emotions beneath the surface. "Everything I've done since then has been to ensure Ethan's future." The unexpected confidence caught Sarah off guard. "He admires you greatly," she offered. "That much is obvious." A ghost of a smile touched Jackson's lips. "Admiration and good sense don't always travel together. Ethan sees the best in people. It's made him successful in ways I'll never be, but it's also made him vulnerable." "And you see the worst in people?" Sarah ventured. "I see what is, not what I wish to be." His eyes met hers, direct and challenging. "Like you, Mrs. Mitchell." Before she could respond to this assessment, Ethan stirred, mumbling in his sleep. Jackson immediately leaned forward, laying a hand on his brother's forehead. "He's warm," he said, concern sharpening his voice. "Too warm." Sarah moved to the bedside and placed her own hand on Ethan's brow. Heat radiated from his skin, the beginning of the fever she had feared. "We need to cool him down," she said decisively. "Cold compresses and willow bark tea if you have any." "Maggie keeps medicinals in the pantry," Jackson said, already moving toward the door. "I'll find it." For the next several hours, they worked together to fight Ethan's rising fever. Sarah bathed his face and chest with cool water while Jackson coaxed sips of willow bark tea between his brother's cracked lips. Outside, the storm reached its peak, the wind screaming around the eaves like a living thing. Near midnight, with Ethan finally resting more comfortably, Jackson insisted Sarah get some rest. "I'll wake you if his condition changes," he promised. She was too exhausted to argue, retreating to the kitchen where she collapsed into a chair at the table, her head pillowed on her arms. Sleep claimed her almost immediately, deep and dreamless. A hand on her shoulder woke her sometime later. Sarah started upright, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the gray light of pre-dawn filtering through the windows. "Easy," Jackson said, his voice rough with fatigue. "It's just me." She rubbed her eyes, memories of the previous day returning. "Ethan, how is he?" Fever broke about an hour ago. He's sleeping naturally now. Jackson sank into the chair opposite, her exhaustion evident in every line of his body. You saved his life. I only did what anyone would have done, Sarah demurred. That's not true, and we both know it. His gaze held hers steadily. Most women would have panicked at the sight of such a wound. You didn't hesitate. Sarah looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. As I said, I've had some experience with medical matters. Jackson was silent for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You're not what I expected, Sarah Mitchell. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it struck her forcibly. What did you expect? When Thomas spoke of his wife, he described a gentle soul, refined, suited to parlors and church socials. Jackson's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. He didn't mention your backbone. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, both at the mention of Thomas and at Jackson's frank assessment. People often see what they expect to see, she said carefully. Thomas saw a suitable wife. His parents saw an inadequate daughter-in-law. You, see? A woman of surprising depth, Jackson finished for her, and considerable courage. The compliment hung in the air between them, charged with meanings Sarah wasn't prepared to examine. She rose abruptly. I should check on Ethan. Jackson caught her wrist as she passed, the contact sending an unexpected jolt through her system. Sarah! She stopped, not pulling away but not meeting his eyes either. Yes? Thank you. His voice was low, intimate in the quiet kitchen. Truly. Sarah nodded once, unable to form words around the sudden tightness in her throat. Jackson released her wrist and she fled to the guest room, her heart pounding with emotions she wouldn't name. Ethan was indeed sleeping peacefully, his color much improved from the previous night. Sarah checked his bandages, relieved to find no fresh bleeding, then sat beside him, using the familiar tasks of caregiving to steady her racing thoughts. What was happening to her? This wasn't part of her plan. This confusion, this awareness of Jackson Wells as more than her employer. She had come to Raven Creek seeking refuge, nothing more. A place to heal from Thomas's death and the rejection of his family, a chance to rebuild her life on her own terms. Jackson Wells represented complications she didn't need. A man with enemies, with secrets, with a past that seemed to be reaching into the present with violent intent. Yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him, the strange sense of recognition whenever their eyes met. Ethan stirred, interrupting her troubled thoughts. His eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition as he focused on her face. Mrs. Mitchell, he murmured. Still here, I see. Where else would I be? She replied, offering him water. How do you feel? Like I've been trampled by a herd of particularly vindictive cattle. He accepted the water gratefully. Did Jackson... Oh, catch them? Sarah frowned. Catch who? The men who shot me. Ethan's expression darkened. He rode out after them, didn't he? Cold dread pooled in Sarah's stomach. He was with you all night. We were tending your fever. Ethan struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. Then where is he now? The sound of hoofbeats outside answered his question. Sarah moved to the window in time to see Jackson mounting his stallion, rifle secured in a scabbard at his side. Frank Cooper stood nearby, gesturing urgently, but Jackson shook his head sharply and spurred his horse forward, disappearing down the track that led toward the main road. God's teeth, Ethan swore softly. He's going after them alone. Sarah turned back to the bed, her concern evident. After who? The men who shot you? Not just them. Ethan's face was grim. He's going to confront Porter and Blackwood, and if I know my brother, he won't be diplomatic about it. But that's madness. He has no proof they were involved. Jackson doesn't need proof. He needs justice. Ethan pushed back the covers, attempting to stand. Help me up. I need to go after him. Sarah pressed him back firmly. You're not going anywhere. You've lost too much blood, and those stitches won't hold if you ride. You don't understand, Ethan insisted, though he stopped struggling against her restraining hands. Blackwood's been waiting for an excuse. This confrontation is exactly what he wants. What do you mean? What's really happening here, Ethan? He hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. It's not my story to tell. It is if Jackson's riding into danger, Sarah countered. If you can't go after him, at least tell me what he's facing. Ethan studied her for a long moment as if weighing her trustworthiness. Finally, he sighed. Jackson and Blackwood knew each other back east. They were, he paused, choosing his words carefully, business associates of a sort. What sort of business? The kind that operates outside the law. Ethan's gaze was steady, challenging. Her to judge. Jackson was young, angry after our father's death. He fell in with Blackwood's crowd, learned to use his fists, his wits, and when necessary, a gun. Sarah tried to reconcile this image with the controlled, honorable man she had come to know. He was an outlaw. Never that, Ethan said firmly. A enforcer, maybe, debt collector, but he never crossed certain lines even at his lowest. Blackwood did, regularly. What happened between them? Blackwood took a job that involved hurting a woman. Jackson intervened. It got ugly. Ethan's expression darkened at the memory. We left Boston the next day, headed west, with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the few dollars Jackson had saved. Started over in Wyoming territory, where no one knew our names or our past. And now Blackwood's found you, Sarah concluded, after all these years. Nothing happens by chance where Isaiah Blackwood is concerned, Ethan confirmed. He arranged to work with Porter specifically to get to Jackson. The Morrison property, the transfer deadlines, my ambush, it's all part of his plan to force a confrontation on his terms. The pieces fell into place in Sarah's mind. The mysterious rider watching the ranch, Jackson's wariness around Porter and Blackwood, the tension that hung in the air whenever the banker's name was mentioned. We have to stop him, she said decisively, rising from her seat. He's walking into a trap. You can't, Ethan protested. It's too dangerous, and besides, he's got too much of a head start. Sarah was already moving toward the door. I'm not going to confront Blackwood, but I know someone who might be able to stop Jackson before he does something rash. Who? Sheriff Hardin. Sarah paused at the doorway. The storm's passed. If I leave now, I can reach Eagle Pass by midday. Sarah, no. Ethan's voice was urgent. The roads will be washed out and you don't know the way. I've been studying the ranch maps in Jackson's office, she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. I know the main routes, and I'm a better rider than your brother thinks. Ethan's expression shifted from concern to calculating assessment. Take Maggie with you. She knows these roads better than anyone except Frank, and he needs to stay here. With the hands, Sarah nodded. I'll send Joseph in to sit with you. Rest and don't try to leave that bed. 10 minutes later, Sarah and Maggie Cooper were saddling horses in the barn, the older woman's initial protests having given way to grim determination once the situation was explained. We'll take the creek trail, Maggie said, checking her saddle cinch. It's longer but safer after a storm. The main road will be a muddy mess, and there are places where it runs alongside drop-offs that might have washed away. Sarah secured her borrowed riding skirt and mounted the gentle mare Frank had selected for her. It had been years since she'd ridden regularly, but the familiar movements came back quickly. Jackson's likely taking the main road, Maggie continued. As they rode out, he'll be pushing hard to reach town before Porter and Blackwood can disappear. With any luck, we'll intercept him at Deadman's Crossing. And if we don't? Maggie's expression was grave. Then we'd better hope Sheriff Hardin is both sober and sympathetic to our cause, They rode in tense silence, following the creek as it wound its way eastward through stands of cottonwood and willow. Despite the previous night's storm, the water level was manageable, and they made good time across the saturated landscape. As they crested a rise overlooking a broader valley, Maggie pointed to a distant figure moving along the main road that ran parallel to their position, but several miles north. "That's him," she said with certainty. "He's making good time." They urged their horses to a faster pace, angling northeast to intercept Jackson's path. The terrain grew more challenging. Fallen trees from the storm forcing detours, soft ground, threatening to mire their horses' hooves. By mid-morning, they had drawn closer to the main road, but had not yet reached it. Jackson was now visible less than a mile ahead, his stallion's distinctive gait recognizable even at a distance. "Jackson!" Sarah called, standing in her stirrups to project her voice across the distance. "Wait!" Whether he heard or not, he didn't stop. His single-minded focus drove him forward, seemingly oblivious to their pursuit. Maggie gestured toward a copse of trees ahead. "There's a shortcut through there. It'll bring us out just before Dead Man's Crossing. We can cut him off there." The shortcut proved more challenging than advertised. A narrow game trail that twisted through dense underbrush and across a rocky stream bed. Sarah's thighs burned with the effort of staying mounted as her mare picked her way carefully through the difficult terrain. Finally, they emerged onto the main road just as Jackson approached, his face registering shock as he reined his horse to an abrupt halt. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp with anger and concern. "Stopping you from getting yourself killed," Sarah replied bluntly. "Ethan told me about Blackwood." Jackson's expression hardened. "Go back to the ranch. Both of you, this doesn't concern you." "If you're about to confront a man with a personal vendetta against you, it concerns everyone at Raven Creek," Sarah countered. "What happens to the ranch if you're shot? To Ethan? To the people who depend on you? I can handle Blackwood. Maybe you could once. But he's had years to plan this moment. He chose the time, the place, the circumstances." Sarah urged her, mare closer to his stallion. "At least wait for the sheriff. Let the law handle this." Jackson's laugh was harsh. "The law hardens in Porter's pocket, has been for years." "Then let the hands ride with you," Maggie suggested. "Numbers might make Blackwood think twice." For a moment, indecision warred in Jackson's expression. Then his jaw set stubbornly. "I started this years ago. I'll finish it now, alone. Like hell you will." The uncharacteristic profanity fell from Sarah's lips before she could stop it. "I didn't sew your brother back together just so you could throw your life away on some misguided notion of honor. If you ride into Eagle Pass alone, you're playing right into Blackwood's hands." Jackson stared at her, surprise replacing anger in his eyes. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand enough," Sarah retorted. "I understand that Blackwood hurt someone you cared about and you stopped him. I understand that he's carried that grudge for years, nursing it, feeding it, until it brought him here to destroy what you've built. What I don't understand is why you're so determined to give him exactly what he wants." The silence that followed her outburst was broken only by the soft nickering of their horses and the distant call of a hawk riding the thermal currents above. Finally, Jackson spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "He threatened you." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected statement. "What?" "After you left the kitchen that night. Blackwood made it clear that if I didn't relinquish the Morrison property, he'd ensure you paid the price for my stubbornness." Jackson's hands tightened on his reins, just like Boston all over again, using innocent people as leverage. "That's why you've been watching my cabin at night," Sarah realized. "You've been guarding me." He nodded once, not denying the accusation. "I didn't want to frighten you unnecessarily." "So you thought confronting Blackwood alone was the answer?" Maggie interjected, her tone sharp with disapproval. Men, always thinking with their pride instead of their heads. Jackson's mouth twitched with reluctant amusement. Your husband shares that particular flaw, Mrs. Cooper. And I've broken him of it more than once, she retorted. Now, are you going to listen to reason, or do we need to hog-tie you and drag you back to the ranch? The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the sound of approaching horses from the direction of Eagle Pass. Jackson reacted instantly, moving his stallion to position himself between the women and the newcomers. Around the bend came Sheriff Hardin, accompanied by the doctor and 2 deputies. The sheriff's weathered face registered surprise at the tableau before him. "Wells," he greeted cautiously. "Wasn't expecting to find you on the road today." "Sheriff," Jackson acknowledged, his posture still tense. "Dr. Harrison, you're headed for my ranch, I assume." "Got word your brother was shot," the doctor confirmed, "though it seems the news traveled faster than we did." Maggie explained Sarah's emergency treatment of Ethan's wounds and his current stable condition, earning an appreciative nod from the doctor. "Still need to check him over," Harrison said. "Bullet wounds have a way of turning nasty when you least expect it." Sheriff Hardin studied Jackson with narrowed eyes. "And where were you headed in such a hurry, Wells?" "Not toward your injured brother, from the looks of it. I had business in town," Jackson replied evenly. "With Porter and Blackwood?" The sheriff's direct question suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "Interesting coincidence, them, leaving town so suddenly this morning." Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Maggie. The shortcut proved more challenging than advertised. A narrow game trail that twisted through dense underbrush and across a rocky streambed. Sarah's thighs burned with the effort of staying mounted as her mare picked her way carefully through the difficult terrain. Finally, they emerged onto the main road just as Jackson approached, his face registering shock as he reined his horse to an abrupt halt. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp with anger and concern. "Stopping you from getting yourself killed," Sarah replied bluntly. "Ethan told me about Blackwood." Jackson's expression hardened. "Go back to the ranch. Both of you, this doesn't concern you." "If you're about to confront a man with a personal vendetta against you, it concerns everyone at Raven Creek," Sarah countered. "What happens to the ranch if you're shot? To Ethan? To the people who depend on you?" "I can handle Blackwood. Maybe you could once. But he's had years to plan this moment. He chose the time, the place, the circumstances." Sarah urged her, mare closer to his stallion. "At least wait for the sheriff. Let the law handle this." Jackson's laugh was harsh. "The law? Hardin's in Porter's pocket. Has been for years." "Then let the hands ride with you," Maggie suggested. "Numbers might make Blackwood think twice." For a moment, indecision warred in Jackson's expression. Then his jaw set stubbornly. "I started this years ago. I'll finish it now, alone." "Like hell you will." The uncharacteristic profanity fell from Sarah's lips before she could stop it. "I didn't sew your brother back together just so you could throw your life away on some misguided notion of honor. If you ride into Eagle Pass alone, you're playing right into Blackwood's hands." Jackson stared at her, surprise replacing anger in his eyes. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand enough," Sarah retorted. "I understand that Blackwood hurt someone you cared about and you stopped him. I understand that he's carried that grudge for years, nursing it, feeding it, until it brought him here to destroy what you've built. What I don't understand is why you're so determined to give him exactly what he wants." The silence that followed her outburst was broken only by the soft nickering of their horses and the distant call of a hawk riding the thermal currents above. Finally, Jackson spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "He threatened you." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected statement. "What?" "After you left the kitchen that night. Blackwood made it clear that if I didn't relinquish the Morrison property, He'd ensure you paid the price for my stubbornness. Jackson's hands tightened on his reins, just like Boston all over again, using innocent people as leverage. That's why you've been watching my cabin at night, Sarah realized. You've been guarding me. He nodded once, not denying the accusation. I didn't want to frighten you unnecessarily. So you thought confronting Blackwood alone was the answer? Maggie interjected, her tone sharp with disapproval. Men, always thinking with their pride instead of their heads. Jackson's mouth twitched with reluctant amusement. Your husband shares that particular flaw, Mrs. Cooper. And I've broken him of it more than once, she retorted. Now, are you going to listen to reason, or do we need to hog-tie you and drag you back to the ranch? The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the sound of approaching horses from the direction of Eagle Pass. Jackson reacted instantly, moving his stallion to position himself between the women and the newcomers. Around the bend came Sheriff Hardin, accompanied by the doctor and 2 deputies. The sheriff's weathered face registered surprise at the tableau before him. Wells, he greeted cautiously. Wasn't expecting to find you on the road today. Sheriff, Jackson acknowledged, his posture still tense. Dr. Harrison, you're headed for my ranch, I assume. Got word your brother was shot, the doctor confirmed, though it seems the news traveled faster than we did. Maggie explained Sarah's emergency treatment of Ethan's wounds and his current stable condition, earning an appreciative nod from the doctor. Still need to check him over, Harrison said. Bullet wounds have a way of turning nasty when you least expect it. Sheriff Hardin studied Jackson with narrowed eyes. And where were you headed in such a hurry, Wells? Not toward your injured brother, from the looks of it. I had business in town, Jackson replied evenly. With Porter and Blackwood? The sheriff's direct question suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Interesting coincidence, them, leaving town so suddenly this morning. Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Maggie. They've gone? She asked. Hardin nodded. Packed up and left before dawn. Clark at the hotel said they received an urgent message late last night. His gaze returned to Jackson. Around the same time your brother was shot, I reckon. The implications hung heavy in the air. Jackson's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. So it seems my business in town will have to wait, he said finally. If you'll excuse us, Sheriff, we should return to the ranch. The doctor will want to examine Ethan as soon as possible. Hardin's eyes narrowed further. This have anything to do with those Morrison property papers? Heard there was some issue with the transfer. Nothing that can't be resolved, Jackson replied smoothly. The bank is holding the deed until replacement documents can be processed. The sheriff didn't seem entirely satisfied with this explanation, but he nodded. Well, we'll ride together. Then safety in numbers after what happened to your brother. The return journey was made in uncomfortable silence, Jackson riding beside the sheriff, while Sarah and Maggie followed with the doctor. By the time they reached Raven Creek, the sun was high overhead, its warmth beginning to dry the sodden landscape. As they rode into the ranch yard, Frank Cooper met them with news that the heifer had successfully delivered twin calves during the night, a rare occurrence that the hands were taking as a good omen. Both living? Jackson asked, dismounting with fluid grace despite the hours in the saddle. Strong as can be, Frank confirmed. Joseph's got them in the north barn with their mama. Sheriff Hardin and the doctor went directly to examine Ethan, while Jackson remained in the yard, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed his domain. When the others had gone inside, he turned to Sarah. You should never have followed me, he said, though the anger had faded from his voice. It was dangerous and foolhardy. Yes, she agreed simply. It was. Her ready acquiescence seemed to disarm him. Then why did you do it? Sarah considered her answer carefully. aware that they stood at a crossroads of sorts. The truth would change things between them, perhaps irreversibly. Yet anything less felt like a betrayal of the moment. Because I've lost one man to circumstances beyond my control, she said finally, meeting his gaze directly. I wasn't prepared to stand by and lose another. The naked honesty of her words hung between them, neither an admission of love nor a denial of growing feelings. Jackson's eyes darkened with an emotion Sarah couldn't or wouldn't name. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough with suppressed feeling. Whatever he might have said was interrupted by the return of Sheriff Hardin, his expression grave as he approached them. "Wells, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Privately." Jackson hesitated, glancing at Sarah with a look that promised. Their conversation wasn't finished, then nodded to the sheriff. "My office, then." As the men walked toward the house, Maggie appeared at Sarah's side, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. "Well," she said quietly, "things are certainly getting interesting. Around here." Sarah couldn't disagree. The simple refuge she had sought at Raven Creek Ranch had become something far more complex, a place of danger and secrets, yes, but also of unexpected connections and emotions she had believed buried with Thomas. "What do you think the sheriff wants?" she asked, watching the men disappear into the house. Maggie shook her head. "Nothing good, I'd wager. Hardin's always been careful about choosing sides. If he's getting involved now, it means the situation with Blackwood has escalated beyond local gossip. Do you think Blackwood will return?" "Men like that don't abandon vendettas easily," Maggie replied. "But they also don't like fair fights. He'll bide his time, wait for another opportunity when Jackson's vulnerable." A chill ran down Sarah's spine, despite the midday warmth. "And what about me? If what Jackson said is true, Blackwood sees me as a potential weapon against him." Maggie's expression softened with unexpected compassion. "That depends on what you mean to Jackson Wells, doesn't it? And perhaps more importantly, what he means to you." The question hung in the air, unanswered but unavoidable. What did Jackson Wells mean to her? More than an employer, certainly. More than a friend. The answer to that lay in territory Sarah wasn't yet ready to explore, a landscape of emotions and possibilities beyond the simple survival that had been her focus since Thomas's death. Yet as she stood in the Wyoming sunshine, surrounded by the life Jackson had built from nothing, Sarah couldn't deny the spark of something new taking root within her. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but its possible beginning. The meeting between Jackson and Sheriff Hardin lasted well over an hour. Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, preparing dinner while trying not to speculate about what was being discussed. Behind the closed door of Jackson's office, occasionally, raised voices filtered through, not enough to discern words, but sufficient to confirm that the conversation was heated. When the sheriff finally emerged, his expression was grim. He nodded curtly to Sarah as he passed through the kitchen. "Mrs. Mitchell," he acknowledged, "fine job with young Wells's wound. Doctor says he might have bled out without your quick work." "Thank you, Sheriff," Sarah replied, wiping flour from her hands. "Will you stay for dinner?" "There's plenty." Hardin shook his head. "Need to get back to town. More trouble brewing than just this business with Ethan." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Watch yourself, ma'am. This situation's got more angles than a crooked dealer's deck." Before Sarah could respond, he tipped his hat and was gone, his deputies falling in behind him as they rode away from the ranch. Dr. Harrison remained behind to monitor Ethan's recovery, accepting the guest room for the night. Jackson didn't appear for the evening meal. When Sarah brought a tray to his office, she found the door locked, no response to her soft knock. Concerned, she left the tray outside the door and retreated to the kitchen, where Maggie was helping with the washing up. "He gets like this sometimes," Maggie explained when Sarah described Jackson's self-imposed isolation. Goes deep inside himself when he's working through a problem. Frank says it's best to leave him be until he's ready to emerge. But what about Porter and Blackwood? Shouldn't we be discussing what to do next? Maggie's hands stilled in the dishwater. Jackson Wells has been making his own decisions since he was 17 years old. He's not a man who takes counsel easily, even from those who care about him. Sarah caught the implication in Maggie's words. I don't. That is, my concern is professional, of course, as his employee. Of course, Maggie agreed, though her knowing smile suggested she believed otherwise. Just as his concern for your safety is merely that of an employer for his housekeeper. Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks. Maggie Cooper, you're as bad as the gossips in Cottonwood Springs. Oh, I doubt that. Maggie chuckled, resuming her washing. I have your best interests at heart, which is more than can be said for Martha Mitchell and her ilk. The mention of her former mother-in-law brought a familiar pang. Despite everything, Sarah sometimes missed the life she'd had with Thomas, the simple, uncomplicated expectations of being a merchant's wife in a small town. There had been comfort in that role, even with its difficulties. Do you ever regret it, she asked suddenly. Leaving Illinois, coming west with Frank? Maggie considered the question, her hands continuing their rhythmic work. There are days, she admitted, days when the wind never stops howling and the isolation closes in like a fist. Days when I'd give almost anything for a proper ladies' tea or a conversation that doesn't revolve around cattle and weather, she smiled. But then Frank comes in from a long day, kisses me like I'm still 20, and I remember why we came. Out here, we're building something real, something that will outlast us. And that's worth the sacrifice? Most things worth having require sacrifice, Sarah. The question is whether what you gain outweighs what you give up. Maggie studied her face. Are you having doubts about staying? No, Sarah answered quickly, perhaps too quickly. No, I'm grateful for the position, for the fresh start. Maggie nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good, because I think Raven Creek needs you, and not just for your cooking. Later that evening, as Sarah walked back to her cabin beneath a sky ablaze with stars, she pondered Maggie's words. What exactly was she building here at Raven Creek? A temporary refuge, as she'd first intended, or something more lasting? The ranch was quiet at this hour, most of the hands either asleep in the bunkhouse or enjoying a rare night in town. As she approached her cabin, Sarah noticed a light burning in the window, a lamp she was certain she hadn't left lit. Caution slowed her steps. With Blackwood's threats lingering, even the smallest anomaly seemed ominous. She considered returning to the main house, but the rational part of her mind argued against such paranoia. She'd probably lit the lamp herself and forgotten in the chaos of the day. Even so, she approached carefully, listening for any sound from within. Hearing nothing, she pushed the door open slowly. Jackson Wells sat at her small table, his tall frame looking out of place in the modest surroundings. The lamp cast his face in sharp relief, highlighting the weariness etched there. Mr. Wells, Sarah gasped, startled despite having half expected an intruder. That is, I didn't think. I apologize for the intrusion, he interrupted, rising from the chair. I should have waited at the main house. No, it's fine, she assured him, closing the door behind her. Is something wrong? Is Ethan? Ethan's resting comfortably. The doctor is pleased with his progress. Jackson ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty. I came to speak with you about what happened today, about what you said on the road. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Of course, he wanted to address her impulsive declaration. Heat rose in her cheeks at the memory. Mr. Wells, I spoke out of turn. The emotion of the moment. You were right, he said simply. She blinked, caught off guard. I'm sorry. You were right, he repeated, meeting her gaze directly. I was playing into Blackwood's hands, acting exactly as he anticipated I would. Sarah moved to the stove, needing something to occupy her hands. "Would you like tea?" she offered, grasping at routine to steady herself. Jackson nodded, resuming his seat at the table, while Sarah busied herself with the kettle and cups. The domestic familiarity of the task calmed her nerves somewhat, though she remained acutely aware of his presence in the small space. "What did Sheriff Hardin want?" she asked as she set the water to boil. "To warn me," Jackson replied. "Porter has filed a complaint alleging that I'm attempting to defraud the bank by failing to complete the land transfer on time. According to Hardin, there's talk of an investigation that could lead to criminal charges." Sarah turned to face him, shocked. "But that's absurd. The documents were stolen when Ethan was ambushed. How can Porter possibly claim fraud?" "Blackwood's work," Jackson said grimly. "He's created a narrative that serves Porter's interests while targeting me directly. The theft of the documents becomes not a crime against us, but evidence of our supposed deception. But surely Sheriff Hardin doesn't believe that. Hardin's position is complicated." Jackson's expression hardened. "He's beholden to the bank for his position, but he's not entirely corrupt. He came here today to suggest that resolving the situation quickly would be in everyone's best interest." "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning I should relinquish my claim to the Morrison property, accept Porter's revised terms, which would essentially put Raven Creek in debt to the bank for years, and forget about prosecuting whoever shot Ethan." Sarah set 2 cups on the table with more force than necessary. "That's outrageous. After everything that's happened, they expect you to simply surrender?" "It's the path of least resistance," Jackson said, his tone neutral though his eyes betrayed his anger, and from Porter's perspective, the most profitable outcome. The kettle whistled and Sarah turned away to prepare the tea. When she returned to the table, she found Jackson studying a small wooden carving that had been sitting on her shelf, a simple figure of a bird in flight that Thomas had made for her during their courtship. "Thomas made this?" he asked, setting it down carefully. "Yes, he enjoyed woodworking." Sarah poured the tea, her hands steady despite the emotions churning within her. "He had a gift for finding the shape hidden within the wood." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "He spoke of it occasionally, said it helped clear his mind when business concerns became overwhelming." "You knew him well," Sarah observed, taking the seat opposite Jackson. "We met when he first came to Wyoming territory, looking to establish a mercantile outpost in Cottonwood Springs. I supplied cattle to the mining camps in the area, and he arranged provisions for the miners." Jackson sipped his tea, his expression distant with memory. "He was honest, straightforward, rare qualities in business then or now." "Yes," Sarah agreed softly. "That was Thomas." A comfortable silence fell between them as they drank their tea. Outside, the night creatures of the Wyoming spring began their chorus. Frogs by the creek, an owl in the cottonwoods, the distant yip of a coyote. "I never expected to bring you into this situation," Jackson said finally. "When I offered you the position, I had no idea Blackwood had returned, that he would target those around me." "You couldn't have known," Sarah assured him. "Nevertheless, I've placed you in danger." His hands tightened around his cup. "Blackwood doesn't make idle threats. If he's threatened you once, he'll do so again." "What will you do about the Morrison property?" Sarah asked, sensing his struggle with the decision. "I don't know," Jackson admitted. "The water rights are crucial for expanding the herd, but not at the cost of putting everyone at Raven Creek at risk. Certainly not at the cost of your safety." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, its implications too significant to ignore. Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could retreat into the safety of formality, maintaining the boundaries of their employer-employee relationship, or she could acknowledge the deeper currents that had been building between them since her arrival. "Mr. Wells," she began carefully. "Jackson," he corrected her. After today, I think we've moved beyond formalities, don't you? Sarah nodded, a small smile touching her lips. Jackson, then, I want you to understand that I made my choice when I came to Raven Creek. I chose to leave Cottonwood Springs, to start anew. Whatever dangers come with that decision, they're mine to face. Sarah, please, let me finish. She drew a steadying breath. For months after Thomas died, I existed in a sort of limbo, not truly living, just enduring. When Martha Mitchell finally forced me to leave, it felt like the end of everything. But now I see it was actually a beginning. She met his gaze directly, drawing courage from the intensity she found there. I won't be driven away by Blackwood's threats or Porter's schemes. This place, she gestured around her, encompassing not just the cabin but the ranch beyond, has become home in a way Cottonwood Springs never truly was. And the people here. She hesitated, then continued. You, Ethan, the Coopers, you've become important to me. Jackson reached across the table, his hand covering hers. And you to us, he said quietly, to me. The touch of his hand sent warmth coursing through her, both comforting and disquieting in its intimacy. For so long, Sarah had held herself apart from such connections, first in grief for Thomas, then in fear of further loss. Yet here, in this moment, those defenses seemed to crumble. What happens now? She asked, not withdrawing her hand. I meet with Porter tomorrow, Jackson replied. Try to negotiate a resolution that protects Raven Creek without capitulating entirely. And Blackwood? His expression darkened. Blackwood is another matter entirely. Our conflict goes beyond business concerns. Because of what happened in Boston. The woman, he threatened. Jackson's surprise was evident. Ethan told you. Only the broad strokes. That you protected someone and Blackwood never forgave the interference. For a moment, Jackson seemed to debate with himself. Then he sighed, his shoulders releasing tension he'd clearly been carrying for years. Her name was Rebecca Sullivan, he began, his voice low. She worked at a tavern where Blackwood and I often conducted business. She was kind. Saw something in me worth salvaging when most people only saw a hired tough. A half smile touched his lips before fading. She had a young son and was determined to provide him a better life than she'd had. Sarah listened quietly, sensing both the importance of the story and the difficulty Jackson had in telling it. Blackwood had arranged financing for a businessman named Frederick Holloway, a man with expensive tastes and questionable ethics. When Holloway fell behind on his payments, Blackwood was assigned to collect the debt. Jackson's expression hardened. Holloway frequented the tavern where Rebecca worked. He made advances. She rejected them. Sarah felt a chill, anticipating the direction of the story. And Holloway retaliated. Jackson nodded grimly. He claimed she had stolen from him, a gold watch worth more than she'd earned in a year. Blackwood saw an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. He informed Rebecca that her theft would be forgiven if she provided certain services to Mr. Holloway. Otherwise, she'd face prosecution that would certainly separate her from her son. That's monstrous, Sarah whispered. Blackwood has always excelled at finding leverage against those weaker than himself, Jackson agreed. What he didn't anticipate was Rebecca telling me about the arrangement, or my response to it. You confronted him, Sarah guessed. I did more than confront him. Oh, there was no pride in Jackson's voice, only a quiet acknowledgement of past violence. I made it clear that if he pursued his plan, he would answer to me, permanently. And he backed down. Temporarily, but he made sure I paid for the interference. A week later, Ethan was attacked on his way home from school, beaten badly enough to spend 3 days unconscious. The message was unmistakable. So you left Boston, Sarah concluded, to protect Ethan, To protect both Ethan and Rebecca, Jackson corrected. I made arrangements for her and her son to travel west to St. Louis, where her sister lived. Then Ethan and I headed in the opposite direction, drawing Blackwood's attention away from her. The selflessness of the act struck Sarah forcibly. The young man Jackson described, barely more than a boy himself, responsible for a younger brother, working in a world of violence and coercion, had still found the moral compass to protect those even more vulnerable. "Did it work?" she asked. "Did Rebecca and her son escape safely?" A shadow crossed Jackson's face. "I received one letter about 6 months after we parted ways. They had reached St. Louis safely. She had found employment as a housekeeper for a respectable family. Her son was attending school." He paused. "I never heard from her again. I thought it safer that way for all concerned." "And now Blackwood has found you," Sarah said softly. "After all these years. Some men nurture grudges the way others." "Tend gardens," Jackson replied. "Blackwood has always been particularly skilled at cultivating resentment." The implications of the story settled between them, illuminating both past events and present dangers. If Blackwood had been willing to use a woman against Jackson all those years ago, he would certainly do so again. The threat against Sarah wasn't merely a negotiation tactic, it was personal, a way to recreate the scenario that had driven them from Boston, but with Blackwood ensuring a different outcome this time. "You can't face him alone," Sarah said decisively. "If this is personal, he won't be satisfied with business concessions." "No," Jackson agreed, "but I can't involve others in what is essentially my fight. It became our fight when he threatened me, when he arranged for Ethan to be shot." Sarah's voice was firm. "Raven Creek isn't just your home, Jackson. It's ours too. Everyone who works here, who has built a life here. We all have a stake in its future." The force of her conviction seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, he studied her with an intensity that made her heart race. "You're not what I expected, Sarah Mitchell," he said finally, echoing his words from earlier that day. "You never have been." "Is that a compliment or a complaint?" she asked, attempting to lighten the moment. "Definitely a compliment." His smile was brief but genuine, "though it does complicate my neat plans for noble self-sacrifice." "Good," Sarah squeezed his hand, "because I think we've both had enough of sacrificing our happiness for others' expectations." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Jackson's eyes held hers, the depths of emotion there, both exhilarating and terrifying in their intensity. For a heartbeat, Sarah thought he might lean across the table to kiss her. For an equally breathless moment, she wanted him to. Instead, he released her hand gently and rose from his chair. "It's late. You need rest after the day's events." Disappointment mingled with relief as Sarah nodded, also standing. "Yes, and you have an early meeting with Porter tomorrow." At the door, Jackson turned back to her. "Thank you," he said simply, "for today, for Dean understanding." "You're welcome," she replied, equally simple. After he left, Sarah remained standing in the center of her cabin, her emotions in turmoil. The day had transformed her understanding of Jackson Wells, revealing depths of character and history she hadn't imagined. It had also forced her to confront her own feelings, the growing attachment she could no longer dismiss as mere gratitude or professional respect. Was she ready for such emotions? Thomas had been gone only 6 months. The wound of his loss was still fresh, the future she'd planned with him still a recent ghost. Yet standing in her small cabin, with the memory of Jackson's hand on hers still, warming her skin, Sarah couldn't deny that something had changed. That she had changed. Sleep was elusive that night, her mind replaying moments from the day, Jackson's face when he'd seen her on the road to Eagle Pass, his quiet intensity as he'd shared the story of Boston, the near tangible connection that had sparked between them at her kitchen table. Dawn found her still awake, watching as the first pale light filtered through her window. With it, came resolution. Whatever happened with Porter and Blackwood, whatever complications the day might bring, Sarah would face them alongside Jackson, not as his employee, but as his ally, perhaps in time as something more. She dressed quickly and walked to the main house, the early morning air crisp against her skin. The ranch was already stirring, hands moving between the barn and bunkhouse, horses nickering for their morning feed, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen where Maggie would be preparing breakfast. Jackson was saddling his stallion when Sarah approached the barn. He looked up at her footsteps, his expression guarded but softening when he recognized her. "You're up early," he observed. "I wanted to catch you before you left," she explained. "To wish you good luck with Porter." He nodded, his hands continuing their practiced work with the saddle cinches. "Thank you, though I suspect luck will have little to do with the outcome. What's your strategy?" The directness of the question seemed to surprise him. "Honesty, primarily. I'll lay out the situation plainly. Acknowledge that I need the water, rights, but refuse to be held hostage by unreasonable terms. And if Porter insists on those terms," Jackson's jaw tightened, "then I'll explore other options. There's a watershed north of here that might serve our purposes, though it would require significant investment to develop." "What can I do to help?" Sarah asked. He finished with the saddle and turned to face her fully. "Stay safe. Keep an eye on Ethan and—" He hesitated, then continued more softly. "Be here when I return." The simple request held layers of meaning that neither of them was ready to articulate. Sarah nodded, understanding the complex emotions behind the simple words. "I will," she promised. "We all will." As Jackson mounted his horse, Frank Cooper approached, leading his own saddled mount. "Ready when you are, boss," he said, nodding. To Sarah, in greeting, Jackson frowned. "I don't recall asking for company, Frank." "You didn't," the foreman agreed amiably, "but since we're discussing water rights that affect the entire ranch, seemed sensible to have someone along who understands the practical aspects." The argument was logical, though all three knew the real reason for Frank's insistence. Jackson shouldn't face Porter and potentially Blackwood alone. After a moment's consideration, Jackson nodded. "Fair enough. Let's go." As the two men rode away, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that Jackson had accepted support, apprehension about what awaited them in Eagle Pass. Maggie appeared beside her, watching the departing riders with a thoughtful expression. "Frank said he'd keep Jackson from doing anything rash," she commented. "Though heaven knows that man can be stubborn as a mule when his mind's set." "Do you think Porter will negotiate in good faith?" Sarah asked. "Porter's faith is in money first and last," Maggie replied. "If Jackson can make a compelling financial argument, Porter might listen. It's Blackwood that worries me." Sarah nodded, sharing the concern. "Jackson thinks Blackwood's grudge is too personal for business solutions. Men and their pride," Maggie sighed, "creates more trouble than whiskey and women combined." They turned back toward the house where the day's duties awaited. Sarah found herself moving through her tasks with mechanical efficiency, her mind constantly straying to Jackson and Frank in Eagle Pass. What was happening? Had Porter proven reasonable? Had Blackwood shown himself? By midday, she could no longer focus on household chores. Making an excuse to check on Ethan, she found him sitting up in bed. Color returned to his face as he argued with Dr. Harrison about when he could resume normal activities. Another day of rest at minimum, the doctor was insisting as Sarah entered. "Gunshot wounds aren't sprained ankles, young man. I'm not proposing to break horses," Ethan countered. "Just to sit in a chair by the window instead of this bed." Sarah smiled at the familiar brotherly stubbornness. "The doctor's right, Ethan. Another day won't hurt, and it might prevent complications." Ethan's expression brightened at her appearance. "Sarah, tell the good doctor I'm perfectly capable of moving to a chair without reopening my wound." "I'll tell him no such thing," she replied, setting down the tray of lunch she'd brought. In fact, I'll help him tie you to that bed if necessary." Dr. Harrison chuckled. "There you see, even the lady of the house agrees with medical wisdom." A shadow crossed Ethan's face at the casual designation. "Speaking of the master of the house, any word from Jackson?" Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. Frank went with him, though." "Good." Ethan relaxed slightly. "Frank's steady. Won't let Jackson get baited into something foolish." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they ate, but the undercurrent of concern remained. When the doctor left to check on another patient in the bunkhouse, Ethan fixed Sarah with a penetrating gaze. "Something's changed between you and my brother," he stated, rather than asked. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not sure what." "You mean—" "Yes, you are." Ethan's expression was kind but knowing. "I saw how he looked at you yesterday when you returned from trying to stop him on the road, and how you looked at him." "Ethan, She paused, unsure how to explain feelings she was still coming to terms with herself. "It's complicated. Life usually is," he agreed, "especially when it involves Jackson Wells, but I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not even—" He caught himself, seeming to reconsider his words. "Not even Rebecca Sullivan," Sarah suggested quietly. Ethan's surprise was evident. "He told you about Boston last night, about Blackwood, and why you left." "I see." Ethan leaned back against his pillows, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. Jackson doesn't share that story easily, or any part of his past for that matter. "I gathered as much." Ethan studied her face. "You know, when Thomas first mentioned you, Jackson was skeptical. He thought Thomas was seeing what he wanted to see, the perfect merchant's wife, content with town life and social conventions." The revelation startled Sarah. "He knew of me before Thomas died. Thomas spoke of you often during business dealings. His lovely wife Sarah, who made the best apple pie in the territory and could manage household accounts better than any banker." Ethan smiled at the memory. "Jackson thought it was exaggeration, the natural enthusiasm of a newlywed, until he met you at the funeral." Sarah's breath caught. "Jackson was at Thomas's funeral?" Ethan nodded. "At the back. He didn't want to intrude on family grief, but he respected Thomas greatly. He saw you there, your dignity, your strength, despite everything." His expression grew thoughtful. He mentioned later that Thomas hadn't exaggerated after all. The revelation stunned Sarah. Jackson had observed her long before offering her employment at Raven Creek, had seen her at her most vulnerable, yet recognized strength rather than weakness in her grief. Before she could formulate a response, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. Sarah moved to look out, her heart leaping at the sight of Jackson and Frank returning. Their expressions, visible even from a distance, suggested the meeting with Porter had not gone as hoped. "They're back," she told Ethan, already moving toward the door. "I should go," Ethan urged. "And Sarah, whatever happened in Eagle Pass, remember that Jackson needs someone who sees him clearly. Not just the hard exterior he shows the world, but the man beneath." Sarah nodded, touched by Ethan's insight and implicit blessing. "I'll try." She hurried downstairs and out to the yard, reaching it just as Jackson dismounted. His face was drawn with tension, a bruise darkening along his jaw, suggesting the negotiations had become physical at some point. "Jackson," she gasped. "What happened?" He handed his reins to a waiting ranch hand before turning to her. "Not here," he said quietly. "My office." Frank dismounted more slowly, his own face bearing a cut above one eye. He caught Sarah's questioning glance and shook his head slightly, a warning not to press for details in the open yard. Sarah followed Jackson to the house, concern mounting with each step. Whatever had transpired in Eagle Pass, it was clearly worse than they had anticipated. In his office, Jackson poured himself a measure of whiskey, downing it in one swallow before pouring another. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, inviting Sarah to sit. "Porter's terms are impossible," he said without preamble. "He's demanding not just payment for the Morrison property, but a controlling interest in Raven Creek itself, 40% ownership to be precise." "That's outrageous," Sarah exclaimed. "How can he possibly justify such terms?" "He claims the recent troubles, meaning Ethan's shooting and the stolen documents, demonstrate that Raven Creek is a high-risk investment requiring additional security." Jackson's knuckles whitened around his glass. "In reality, it's Blackwood. He's pulling the strings. He wants a foothold here, a legal right to insert himself into our operations. And the alternative, foreclosure on the existing loans for the breeding stock we purchased last fall." Jackson's expression was grim. "Porter has called those notes due immediately, claiming breach of contract due to the delayed Morrison transfer. The implications were clear and devastating. Without the funds to repay those loans, Raven Creek would be forced to sell assets, likely at a fraction of their value, given Porter's manipulation of the situation. "There must be another option," Sarah insisted, her mind racing. "Another bank, perhaps, or investors from Cheyenne." "I've considered both," Jackson replied, "but establishing new banking relationships takes time we don't have, and investors would want assurances about water rights before committing funds." "The bruise on your jaw," Sarah said quietly. "That wasn't from negotiations with Porter, was it?" Jackson's mouth tightened. "Blackwood was waiting outside the bank. He made his position quite clear." "He attacked you? In broad daylight?" "Not exactly. He suggested we discuss old times in the alley behind the saloon. Being a fool, I agreed." Jackson's smile held no humor. "Frank intervened before things got truly interesting." Sarah could well imagine what might have happened without Frank's presence. "What will you do now?" Jackson set down his glass, his decision apparently made. "I'm riding to Cheyenne tomorrow. There's a cattle broker there who might advance funds against our fall shipments. It won't solve the water rights issue, but it might buy us time to find a more permanent solution." "Cheyenne is 3 days' ride," Sarah protested. "And Blackwood—" "We'll have to wait," Jackson finished firmly. "Raven Creek comes first. The people who depend on it come first." The logic was sound, yet Sarah couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Blackwood had demonstrated his patience and calculation. Would he simply wait while Jackson sought alternative financing? Or was this separation precisely what he had been maneuvering toward? "I don't like it," she said honestly. "It feels like we're playing into his hands somehow." "Perhaps," Jackson acknowledged, "but I see no alternative. Without additional funds, Porter can begin foreclosure proceedings within the week." Sarah wished she could offer a solution, some brilliant strategy that would protect both Jackson and Raven Creek. But the complexities of banking and land deals were beyond her experience. All she could offer was support and her presence, small comforts against the forces arrayed against them. "When will you leave?" she asked finally. "First light," Jackson replied. "With luck, I'll return within a week." It wasn't enough time to secure the ranch's future, but it might be enough to prevent immediate disaster. Sarah nodded, accepting the necessity, if not the wisdom, of the plan. "Ethan should remain in bed another day at least," she said, shifting to practical matters. "Dr. Harrison will likely leave tomorrow once he's satisfied with Ethan's progress." "And you?" Jackson asked, his eyes meeting hers directly. "Will you be here when I return?" The echo of his earlier request carried even greater weight now, with threats mounting from multiple directions. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'll be here," she promised. "We all will." For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was ready to name, but both increasingly recognized. Then Jackson nodded, the gesture conveying both gratitude and determination. "Good," he said simply, "because I believe we have unfinished business to discuss when this crisis is resolved." The statement, delivered with quiet intensity, sent warmth coursing through Sarah's veins despite her concerns about the coming days. Whatever dangers loomed, whatever challenges awaited, one thing had become clear. Jackson Wells saw her as more than an employee, more than a responsibility. He saw her as a woman worth returning to. And for Sarah Mitchell, widow and exile, that realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. A promise of possibilities she had believed forever closed to her after Thomas's death. "Yes," she agreed softly. "I believe we do." Dawn broke clear and cold over Raven Creek Ranch. The sky painted in shades of amber and rose as Jackson prepared for his journey to Cheyenne. Sarah stood on the porch of the main house, a basket of provisions in her hands, watching as he secured his saddlebags and checked his weapons one final time. 3 days there, 3 days back, he reminded her, taking the basket and attaching it to his saddle. A day or two of negotiations if all goes well. And if it doesn't, Sarah couldn't help asking. Jackson's expression remained steady, though his eyes betrayed his concern. "Then we'll face that challenge when it comes." He glanced toward the guest room window where Ethan was likely watching. "Keep an eye on my stubborn brother. Don't let him push himself too quickly." "I promise," Sarah assured him. "And Frank has doubled the patrols around the ranch. We'll be vigilant while you're away." For a moment, Jackson seemed about to say something more, something beyond the practicalities of his absence. Instead, he merely nodded, his gaze lingering on her face as if committing it to memory. "1 week," he said finally. "If I haven't returned in 1 week..." "You will," Sarah interrupted firmly. "We'll be here waiting." With a final nod, Jackson mounted his stallion and rode away, his figure gradually diminishing against the vast Wyoming landscape. Sarah remained on the porch long after he had disappeared from view, an unsettled feeling taking root in her chest. Despite her outward confidence, the day passed in a haze of routine tasks, each hour marked by Sarah's frequent glances toward the horizon as if expecting Jackson to reappear. By afternoon, a restlessness had settled over the ranch. The hands, moving between their duties with unusual vigilance, Frank Cooper checking and rechecking the boundaries of the property. Ethan, against Dr. Harrison's advice, had relocated to the sitting room, where he alternated between staring out the window and attempting to conduct ranch business despite his injury. "You should be resting," Sarah admonished as she brought him tea. "I'll rest when Jackson returns with a solution to our financial predicament," Ethan replied, though he accepted the tea with a grateful nod. "Until then, I need to prepare contingency plans." Sarah sat opposite him, her own cup warming her hands. "Do you believe the broker in Cheyenne will help?" Ethan's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Marcus Drummond is a reasonable businessman. If anyone can be persuaded to advance funds against future cattle shipments, it's him." He sipped his tea, his expression thoughtful. "But I worry it won't be enough. Porter has engineered this situation too carefully." "What if we found evidence linking Blackwood to Ethan's shooting?" Sarah suggested. "Surely even Porter couldn't continue his demands if his associate was proven to be a criminal. Evidence would require witnesses," Ethan pointed out, "and witnesses against men like Blackwood have a way of disappearing." Evening brought no relief from the tension. Sarah retired to her cabin earlier than usual, exhaustion from the previous day's events finally claiming her. She fell into a troubled sleep, dreams flitting between memories of Thomas and concerns for Jackson, the two men's faces sometimes blurring in her unconscious mind. A sound woke her sometime past midnight, the soft creak of a floorboard outside her door. Sarah lay perfectly still, straining to hear above the pounding of her heart. It could be a ranch hand on patrol, or perhaps Frank checking the perimeter. Then came another sound, the quiet rasp of metal against metal, like a key turning in a lock. Only it wasn't her lock, which remained securely bolted from within. Sarah slid silently from her bed, reaching for the small Derringer pistol Jackson had insisted she keep nearby. The weapon felt foreign in her hand, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. The door handle turned slowly, testing. Finding it locked, whoever stood outside paused. Sarah held her breath, the pistol raised toward the door. Then, unexpectedly, a voice called softly through the wood. "Mrs. Mitchell? It's Joseph from the bunkhouse. Mr. Cooper sent me to check on you." Relief flooded through Sarah, followed immediately by suspicion. Why would Frank send someone to check on her in the middle of the night? "Joseph," she called back, keeping her voice steady, "is everything all right?" "Yes, ma'am. Just a routine check, what with Mr. Wells away." A pause. "Mind opening the doctor so I can report back that you're secure?" Sarah moved closer to the door, but didn't unlock it. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm quite safe. Please tell Mr. Cooper I'll see him in the morning." Another pause, longer this time. "As you wish, ma'am. Good night." Footsteps retreated from her porch, fading into the darkness. Sarah waited, listening intently. The Derringer still clutched. In her hand, something felt wrong about the exchange, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Joseph was one of the newer hands, hired just before her arrival. She'd had minimal interaction with him, but nothing about his behavior had seemed suspicious until now. Sleep eluded her for the remainder of the night. At the first hint of dawn, Sarah dressed and hurried to the main house, finding Maggie already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. "Maggie, did Frank send Joseph to check on me last night?" she asked without preamble. Maggie's hands stilled in their work. "Not that I'm aware of. Frank was with the North Pasture crew until midnight, then came home and hasn't left since." Her expression sharpened with concern. "Why do you ask?" Sarah explained the nocturnal visitor, watching Maggie's face grow increasingly troubled. "That doesn't sound right," the older woman confirmed. "Frank would have come himself, or sent Caleb, who's been with us for years, not Joseph, who's still proving himself." "Where is Joseph now?" Sarah asked. "Should be in the bunkhouse with the others. They'll be heading out after breakfast to check the south fence line." Maggie wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll ask Frank to speak with him." By mid-morning, a new worry had emerged. Joseph was nowhere to be found on the ranch. His bunk had been slept in, but his few personal possessions were gone, along with one of the ranch horses. "He must have left before dawn," Frank reported grimly to Sarah and Ethan in the main house. "With me and the others." Sarah shook her head. "No. If there's any chance Jackson is in danger because of me, I need to help." "Sarah," Ethan began, his expression softening. "Jackson would never forgive any of us if harm came to you, especially me. And I would never forgive myself if I did nothing while he was in danger," she countered. "I won't approach the property directly, but I'm going with Frank's group." The argument continued as darkness fell, but in the end, Sarah's determination prevailed. Dressed in men's clothing borrowed from the bunkhouse, a hat pulled low to hide her distinctive red-gold hair, she joined Frank and his men as they prepared to depart. Night had fully descended by the time they reached the creek, separating Raven Creek Ranch from the Morrison property. Water gurgled softly as they picked their way along the rocky bank, the moon occasionally emerging from behind clouds to illuminate their path. The Morrison house appeared dark and abandoned as they approached, its windows blank eyes staring into the night. No lamplight, no movement, no sign of occupation either benign or threatening. Frank signaled for the group to spread out, approaching the house from different angles. Sarah stayed close behind him, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give away their position. From the distance came the sound of hoofbeats, Caleb in his role as decoy, approaching openly along the main road. The rhythmic cadence seemed to match Sarah's accelerated pulse as they crept closer to the silent house. A flicker of movement at one of the windows, brief but unmistakable. Someone was inside, watching, waiting. Frank pressed Sarah lower to the ground as they approached the back door. The handle turned easily under his grasp, the hinges silent as the door swung open to reveal a darkened kitchen. They moved through the abandoned house with excruciating care, each creaking floorboard a potential betrayal of their presence. From the front of the house came the sound of Caleb's horse arriving, followed by a call that mimicked Sarah's voice. With surprising accuracy, "Mr. Blackwood, I've come as instructed." The distraction worked. A shadow detached itself from the front parlor, moving toward the entrance. Frank signaled silently, and his men converged from different directions. What followed was a confusion of shouts, gunshots, and chaos. Sarah found herself pressed against a wall as men struggled in the dimness, identities obscured by darkness and motion. A figure broke free from the melee, charging toward her with unmistakable intent. In the faint moonlight streaming through a window, she recognized Isaiah Blackwood, his face contorted with rage and calculation. Sarah raised the derringer Jackson had given her, her hand surprisingly steady despite her fear. "Stop," she commanded, "or I will shoot." Blackwood's laugh was cold and dismissive. "I doubt you even know how to use that toy, Mrs. Mitchell. Your husband certainly didn't." The taunt registered with horrible clarity. "My husband? Thomas died in a mining accident. Is that what they told you?" Blackwood's smile was terrible in the darkness. "How convenient. No, Mrs. Mitchell, Thomas died because he refused to sell his interest in Cottonwood Springs to certain parties who needed control of the town. Just as Jackson will die because he refuses to surrender Raven Creek." The revelation struck Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas's death, not an accident, but murder, and orchestrated by the same man now threatening Jackson. "You're lying," she managed, though doubt had already taken root. "Ask Jackson if you ever see him again." Blackwood suggested, taking another step toward her. "Ask him how he really knew your husband, why he's kept you so close since Thomas's convenient demise." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, but hesitation cost her the moment of advantage. Blackwood lunged, knocking the derringer from her, and then forcing her back against the wall, his forearm pressed against her throat. "You could have made this simple," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "But now you'll watch as everything Jackson Wells has built turns to ash, starting with you." The pressure against her throat increased, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision as she struggled against his grip. Through the encroaching darkness, she saw movement behind Blackwood, a tall figure silhouetted in the doorway. "Let her go, Isaiah," Jackson's voice, cold and deadly. "Your quarrel is with me." Blackwood's pressure eased slightly as he turned, keeping Sarah as a shield. Between himself and Jackson, Wells. How predictable. I knew threatening her would bring you running back despite the risks. "And I knew you'd never face me directly," Jackson countered, his pistol leveled steadily at Blackwood's head. "Always hiding behind others, using them as leverage or shields." Blackwood's laugh was harsh in the darkness, yet effective, wouldn't you say? "Here you are, walking willingly into my trap, all for a woman, just like Boston." He tightened his grip on Sarah. "History repeats itself, though this time I'll ensure a different ending." Through her fear, Sarah felt a surge of clarity. This moment had been building since she first arrived at Raven Creek, perhaps even before, from the moment Thomas died, and set her on this path toward Jackson Wells and the truth about her husband's death. "You're wrong," she managed, her voice raspy from Blackwood's grip. "History doesn't repeat, people choose." With that, she drove her elbow backward with all her strength, catching Blackwood in the ribs. His grip loosened just enough for her. to duck sideways, clearing Jackson's line of fire. The gunshot echoed through the empty house, followed by the heavy thud of a body falling to the floor. Sarah flinched, expecting pain, before realizing Blackwood lay motionless at her feet, dark stains spreading across his chest. Jackson was beside her in an instant, his free arm encircling her waist to steady her. "Are you hurt?" Sarah shook her head, unable to form words through the tightness in her throat. Around them, the sounds of struggle had ceased, replaced by the voices of Frank and his men securing the house and the remaining intruders. "It's over," Jackson said softly, holstering his pistol to pull her fully into his embrace. "He can't harm anyone ever again." As the initial shock faded, Sarah found her voice. "He said he claimed Thomas's death wasn't an accident, that you knew." Jackson's expression darkened. "I suspected," he admitted. "After it happened, certain details didn't align with a typical mining collapse. I began investigating privately, which led me to connections between Porter's Bank and investments in Cottonwood Springs." He hesitated. "When I saw you at the funeral, I wanted to share my suspicions, but the timing was wrong. You were grieving. And later, when I came to Raven Creek, I planned to tell you once I had proof," Jackson said, his arms tightening around her. "I never imagined Blackwood would appear, or that he'd use you to get to me." The explanation made sense, yet left questions that would require time and trust to fully address. For now, the knowledge that Thomas's death hadn't been the random tragedy she'd believed brought both pain and a strange sense of resolution. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing her question from nights before, though in an entirely different context. Jackson's response was to lower his mouth to hers in a kiss that spoke of relief, longing, and promise. When they parted, his forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the cool night air. "Now we go home," he said simply, "to Raven Creek. Together." The word held resonance beyond its simple meaning, an acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between them, forged through danger and revelation, grief and healing. Whatever challenges lay ahead, explaining to the sheriff, dealing with Porter, securing the ranch's future, they would face them not as employer and employee, but as partners. As they stepped out of the Morrison house into the clear Wyoming night, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, Sarah felt the weight of the past begin to lift. Thomas would always be part of her story, but her life's narrative was still unfolding, new chapters waiting to be written with Jackson at her side. Home to Raven Creek. Together, three simple concepts that combined to create a future she could embrace with both hands. No longer homeless, no longer hopeless, but found. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.